Tomorrow is the 4th of July, and I know there's going to be lots of campfires, bonfires, and people's houses on fire. So what the heck, here are some allegedly true scary campfire stories. These stories are all woodsy and to me made for some good campfire-style tales. Enjoy, and be sure to send me your scary stories at darkstories.org so I can narrate them. Also, check out eeriecast.com for loads more scary podcasts. Quick question, are you guys enjoying the Tales from the Break Room compilations I've been uploading? Anyway, let's begin, and I hope you have a safe and awesome 4th of July 2022. Under the Floor, from George 1997. This happened to me, my brother, and our girlfriends. I was 23 at the time, and after this, my brother and I convinced my dad to sell the place. It was a Tuesday, and I had a week off work. My younger brother had recently been fired from his retail job. He got fired because he was taking some overly long smoke breaks. We decided to take our girlfriends up to our father's cabin for a few days. It's located around Gravenhurst, Ontario. It's a pretty cool area. The cabin was about 25 minutes from town and 15 minutes from our closest neighbors. Basically, it was nice and remote, a private area. Or so we thought. We left Toronto around 5 a.m., and we got to the cabin around 8 a.m. I drove up in my old 95 Chevy Tahoe. My girlfriend, Marie, was in the passenger seat. My brother Mike and his girlfriend Anne were in the back. The cabin itself was a small raised cabin, 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom. Outside there was a parking area, some field area, a small fire pit with benches, and the woods beyond, as well as a good-sized half-workshed, half-garage building, about 40 feet away from the cabin. Our mom and dad built it that far so she wouldn't have to hear the tomfoolery that went on from another of my dad's projects. But my dear old dad hadn't been up to the cabin much since our mom passed away from cancer a few years back. At 8 a.m. we unloaded the coolers and our tied-down bags from off the truck and went up the steps, unlocking the old wooden door, and we went inside to make some breakfast. Marie and I claimed the larger bedroom. Being the older brother comes with some perks. After frying up some bacon and eggs, peppers and onions, and toast, putting together our westerns, we sat on the futon couches in the living room, talking and enjoying the morning. After breakfast, I wanted to relax for a while with my girlfriend. We went to our room and took a nap until about 1 p.m. Then we went out to the fire pit where Mike and Ann had apparently spent the remainder of the morning together, smoking and stirring their small campfire. We sat around the fire for a while. Ann and Mike were arguing about something at some point. Ann claimed she saw something a few hours ago hiding behind the garage. She said it was a short, skinny, dark, shadowy man peeking out from a corner of the garage. But Mike was convinced she was just trying to freak him out, or that she just saw one of the pine trees swaying in the wind over near the garage. But Ann was adamant, angrily going back into the cabin. "Nice going, bro," I said, patting him on the back. He shook his head and lit another cigarette, complaining to Marie and I before we went on to other topics. Suddenly, we heard a scream coming from the cabin. We all stood up and turned to see Anne waving her arms for us to come inside from the large window. We looked to each other and shrugged, then threw some dirt on the fire before walking back into the cabin. Despite Anne's urgent waves, we weren't really in a hurry. Once inside, she locked the door behind us and demanded to be taken home. We asked what she was on about. She explained she saw it again, this black figure. She saw it on the deck through the glass door. It crawled off of the deck and underneath the house. She could even hear it scratching at the floor right where she stood, and that's what made her scream. My brother and I were thinking maybe it was a possum or skunk, that she had scared it so it ran off under the house. We were about to go out to see, but she stopped us, saying it was too dangerous. We convinced her it was probably some small critter just living under the cabin. We tried to get her to calm down, but she got us to stay indoor the rest of the day playing old board games like Scrabble. We snacked and drank some beers from the cooler. Around 10 p.m., when we were about to go to bed, we heard the scratching Anne had described before. It certainly was coming from under the floor in the hallway. It seemed to be making its way to where we were in the living room. Anne grabbed tightly onto Mike's arm, terror in her eyes, but Mike, Marie, and I were unfazed. I suggested we go out and scare whatever was under the house with some flashlights, bang some sticks together, and make some noise. Mike interrupted that idea by slamming his feet on the floor. The scratching suddenly stopped for a minute. But then it came back, more vicious than before. Annoyed, I got up to go outside, but when I was putting on my shoes and looking out the windows, I saw dark shapes moving in the field and around the cabin. I said out loud, "What the heck?" I grabbed a flashlight and pressed both my face and the flashlight against the glass. There must have been around 8 shadowy figures roaming around the cabin. I managed to catch one of their legs in the light of my flashlight, but it was still too fast. From what I saw, the leg was black and leathery against the green grass. Then one of those creatures slammed right up against the glass where my face was. I flew back, everyone screaming behind me. Outside, we heard screeches surrounding the building. Some came from under the house too. Some were even on top of the roof. There was banging on the walls and scratching everywhere. I ran into the larger bedroom, grabbing the rifle my dad kept in the closet. Then I ran back into the living room, aiming it at the floor where I'd heard one of those things scratching. At the same time, my brother, Anne, and Marie had acquired knives from the kitchen. They'd huddled on top of the coffee table that was struggling under their combined weight. I fired off a shot at the floor. Right after that, I heard a screech and scuttering away. I reloaded and repeated this until there was silence outside the cabin. "What do we do?" Mike said. "Get the heck out of here," Marie and Anne both said in different ways. I held a hand up for them to be quiet, not convinced that these weird things were all gone. I looked out the windows again, and I could see things moving in the trees across the field. They were still out there, waiting. I told them what I saw. We stayed inside the cabin for hours, unsure of whether to stay or leave. Eventually, I stopped seeing movement in the trees, so we quietly and quickly packed up our things. The truck was only 10 feet away from the front door. I shone the flashlight around it and into the neighboring woods to make sure we were all clear. It seemed clear, so after locking the cabin door, we made a mad dash for the truck, throwing our stuff inside. We locked the truck doors too and started the engine. When the truck lights turned on, lighting up the driveway, we spotted one of those things running across the road. Taking a deep breath, I put the truck into drive. It jolted forward as I stepped on the gas heavily. Going down the driveway and out onto the road, we saw movement everywhere. The forest seemed to be crawling with shadows. I was so terrified. My eyes burned. I didn't want to shut them for a minute. We turned onto the main road, where I saw one of those things sitting on the road. I pressed on the gas and went over 90 on the dirt road, and I aimed right for it. But when I passed over it, it just stood up on bent limbs and slowly walked away, its eyes never reflecting any light, like gray pools on the all-black, leathery-looking thing. It watched us leave. We didn't stop until we were back in the city. It was around 6 a.m. then when we pulled up into the apartment complex. Honestly, we were surprised we weren't pulled over by how fast I was going. After that, we went up and fell asleep in my apartment, absolutely exhausted. My brother and I don't like talking about what happened back then, and our girlfriends broke up with us weeks later after that. We talked our father into selling the cabin after months of convincing, and I would like to say it's over, but it's not. I still have nightmares where I'm stuck in that cabin, and those things are scratching at the walls and floor. When they finally break through, I wake up. I want to know what they are. I want closure. I am tempted to go back every few years to see if they're still there or if they moved on. Why did they choose to come after us? I want to know. Maybe someone can hear my description and know what these things are, and why they came after 4 young adults just looking for a peaceful trip in the woods. Here's the description from me and my brother combined. They were black and leathery looking, about 4.5 to 5 feet tall, with about 4 claw-like fingers and toes. They had gray, large eyes that don't reflect light, with a skinny body and limbs. They crawled around but sometimes would stand up on 2 legs. Their back legs were bent the wrong way. We couldn't really see the mouth from how far they were from us, but the screeching made our eardrums shake with how loud it was. They're fast and hard to see, and they waited until night to come after us as a pack. If you know what these monstrous things are, please, let us know. I have to know. The Bones from the Fire. From Anonymous. I live in a town in Scotland. It's mostly urban, but we do have a good amount of rural areas. This story happened when I was in primary school. I was 9 years old. I lived in a house very close to the rural areas of the town. These rural areas had loads of abandoned places as part of them, and my friends and I would go to hang out at them. It was summer break at the time. Me and my 2 friends, T and E, decided we'd go and explore the old abandoned graveyard that loads of people would hang out at. After getting some food and drinks from a shop, we went down the long, narrow road that led to the old graveyard. We passed some farms and joked about the smell of cow manure coming from E, and were making other dumb 9-year-old jokes, until we made it to the graveyard. Once there, we all stopped the constant joking, due to us being a bit creeped out, but not wanting to openly admit it. The graves were covered in moss, the names unreadable and hidden by the overgrowth. There were bottles and cans of empty drinks scattered all over the place, and the trees made it darker within. We climbed up onto the old broken-down small building there, sitting down and eating some food and drinks. After a few minutes of laughing together, T stopped and began to stare outside of the graveyard towards the open area near the river. I then looked over where he was looking and saw a group of people at a fire. We could slowly start to hear them shouting things, scaring us. Then a car came up to the graveyard, parking right outside of it, with no one getting out. The 3 of us decided we'd take another way back and ran up the hills that would take us eventually back to the houses, once we ran far enough. While we ran, we could hear the group shouting stuff still. Then a scream came from someone. I didn't look back, but T did. The other people saw him, and one shouted at him to come down to them. But we just kept running after that. 30 minutes later, we were near the houses and a store, but we were still on the farmland. I tripped as I was running, which I'm kind of glad I did, as T then put his hand on an electric fence in front of us, and E had to pull him off of it. That was almost me. It left T with a scar, and the fence surrounded us from getting back to the streets of our town. This meant we had to go back, so we did. When we got to where that group had been, they were gone now, and their campfire had been put out. E ran over to it. When he came back, he brought bones. There was what I could only describe as a deformed bull skull due to the horns on it. E took the skull and bones with him, and we eventually got back to our houses. We played outside at the park for a while. Some boys came over to us and asked E where he got those bones. He told them from a fire near the river. The boys said those bones were cursed, that we had to get rid of them. E put them in the bin in the park, and we all went home, scared of being cursed. The following day, the bones were all gone. However, everything else was still in the bin. This left us 3 to wonder, why would someone bin raid for those bones? If it was just a trash collector, then why only take the bones from the top? We promised each other we would never go back down there, and as far as I know, the 3 of us haven't. I moved to a more urban part of town. A new place meant a new school, and that meant I stopped talking to E. In our last year of primary, E pulled a knife on T, but fortunately someone spotted him. T's parents got a divorce, and he started doing substances in his 3rd year of high school. He then got sent to a behavioral school, and we've only spoken about 3 times since. During my 2nd year of high school, my house burned down, and now as I write this, I'm starting to wonder if that so-called curse had anything to do with any of the bad stuff happening to us. Although it's unlikely, I still can't help but wonder about it. What were those strangers doing during the summer break? Why did they seem so hostile when they saw us? It makes me wonder what they were up to. It's been about 7 years now, and I haven't returned to that graveyard, although some other friends have, including T's cousin. But from what I've heard, the most unusual thing they experienced were wind chimes shaking about and clanging against each other, despite there being no wind at all. Out of all the abandoned places I've been to, and all these strange experiences I've had, those bones were what scared me the most. Bigfoot in remote Maine. From Claymore. My dad's cousin owns a camp in a remote part of the state of Maine, 3 hours from where I live. We go up there with him 2 to 3 times a year to hunt partridge and go fishing. It's such a fun experience to go up there and do things away from the rest of society. It's an introvert's dream, so to speak. This particular trip was quite a bit different from the other trips. We'd spent Friday evening, Saturday, and half of a Sunday up there fishing. We never caught much of anything, but it was still fun to do. We had spent most of Sunday morning packing up our food, sleeping bags, clothes, etc. We spent a few more hours fishing off the dock and just chatting about things from the past, things we hoped to do in the future. Basic discussion. It was around 10 a.m. then, and my dad asked, "All right, bud, you ready to leave?" "Sure," I replied. It was always hard to leave that place because of how beautiful the sunrises were. I figured we would see some wildlife on the ride out, so I looked forward to that. We jumped in the truck and pulled out of the camp driveway. I watched the small house slowly fade into nothing as we drove down the road. The road to get in and out of there is around 15 miles long, so we were in for a treat. We were around 7 miles down the road when we both got thirsty. He stopped the truck to check on the four-wheeler and to get us some Gatorade. That morning the air was brisk and the leaves on the trees were almost gone. It was towards the end of fall. Suddenly something caught my eye in the trees. I looked over near a large oak tree and I saw something that I couldn't yet explain. I saw this black hairy arm wrapped around the tree and a head poking around the tree from side to side. Whatever it was, it seemed quite curious. Then it darted away from the tree and ran up the hill. It stopped at the top of that hill. We made eye contact one last time before it went over the other side of the hill. It was around 7 feet tall and had thick black hair. Its arms looked strong and muscular. Now, I knew my dad was a Bigfoot skeptic, so I asked him if he'd seen that bear. "No, where was it?" he asked. "It ran up that hill," I replied, pointing in the direction I saw it. "Cool, dude," my dad exclaimed. The whole drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about the whole experience. Sometimes I wonder if it was a bear, or if I was seeing things. I just can't convince myself that the thing wasn't a Bigfoot. I looked on the BFRO website and saw that there were several sightings in that part of Maine. I believe, without a doubt, that what I saw was a Bigfoot. The Ghosts Down by the River. From Skull Z. My friend and I were going down to the nearby river to just hang out and make a campfire. Let's call him L. Every time we go down there, we walk past a car crashed into a tree. I can't be sure if it actually crashed, or if it was simply abandoned there. But there was a lot of trash down the hill too. Past that tree is just more hill that goes down farther, and down there is full of trash. We could also smell that trash, mostly rotten deer. Elle and I were walking past that car when we heard a scream down there. At first, we thought our friends were in the car trying to scare us. We looked down at the car but didn't see anyone. Then we looked at each other, a bit worried. The scream came again then, but this time we knew it wasn't in the car because the scream was farther down. "Dude, what the heck is that?" Elle asked. I don't know," I told him. The scream happened once more. If I had to describe it, it sounded like a guy, not too harsh, but also fake, if that makes sense. "No, dude, we're getting out of here," Elle said, shivering. We turned around, and before we could walk away, we could see a truck coming towards us. We waved to say hi. Then we saw a person get out. I think he was coming out to greet us because I think he knew Elle. We told him about the screaming we heard. Then he explained, "Be careful out here. Loved ones and other people have passed away down there." "Why do we need to be careful?" Elle asked. I thought, why would he ask that? Doesn't he know there are dangerous animals out there? That's what I expected this person to explain. But instead, we received this answer. "Because you don't want to anger the spirits down there. You may have to be quiet coming down here so you won't disturb them." Elle and I were both being loud walking down. I looked down at the bottom of the hill and yelled, "Sorry." After that, I felt bad, because I thought I sounded a bit too sarcastic or something. When I looked back at the guy, he looked upset. "Well, you be careful now. I'll see you later." He bid us farewell, then went back to his truck. He backed up out of there and left. I wondered why he stopped by then. Why had he driven this direction? After all, he never even went down to the river. After that, we changed our minds and continued to walk down there. We even threw rocks down the hill. I know it was stupid after hearing about possible spirits down there. But after rolling an especially big rock, I'm talking big, one we couldn't even pick up together, a second later, we heard a little girl scream. This one wasn't soft like the guy's scream. This one was loud, and it hurt my ears. The reason this was unusual was because there was no possible way a little girl could get past all these sticker bushes and brush down there. Nobody really could. There were no paths or anything, and yet we heard people screaming just beyond it. We looked at each other again and started walking back up the trail to a church that was close to the path. I'm not sure if this is scary to you, but it scared us nonetheless. We still go down to the river sometimes, but here on out we're more cautious, never throwing rocks down there again. I hope that whatever is down there isn't especially mad at us. Camping trip gone wrong. From Big Boy Thanos. My brother, his girlfriend, my sister, my parents, and I were going on a camping trip. I was 15 at the time. I just went through a breakup with my girlfriend and was depressed, being quiet 80% of the time. My parents kept telling me to cheer up. They could tell I was trying but wasn't really able to. The day we went camping, we were nearly to our campsite when suddenly we ran into two guys. Both of them were tall and had messy hair, and they smelled like straight up garbage. They asked if we knew where they could find the lake. My dad politely pointed out where to go and how to get there. But something in my gut told me that these two were bad news. They went on their way, then we went on ours. When we made it to the campsite, we set up the tents and the campfire. After that, my big brother and I went off to go hunting. I was the better hunter of the two of us. My brother had his own rifle but wanted to learn from me. After a bit of a hike, I noticed multiple pairs of boot prints in some mud. I was confused because they looked fresh. Now, we were hunting on our land. There should have been no one else in this area. I brushed it off and showed my brother how to hunt a deer. We managed to bag one and bring it back for dinner. The best part of camping for us was eating what we hunted. When nightfall came, I was probably the only one up in my tent still. I was drawing in my notebook. That's when I heard my sister get out of her tent and walk into the woods. I got up and followed her with my rifle. I called out to her, "What are you doing up so late?" She jumped at this and turned around, relieved that it was just me. She punched me for scaring her. She said she was going out for a walk and a smoke. I told her she's gonna need a guide, and she said that's fine, because she was always scared of being lost. We walked together for a few minutes, talking about life, but then I heard something walking nearby. I told her to stop, and I pulled out my rifle. I waited to see what it was, but because of how dark it was difficult to see anything. My sister had a flashlight, but she said that the batteries were dead. I muttered, "Great," and I told her to stay behind me in a whisper. She did as I told her. I yelled out asking who's there. Then one of those two guys from before came out of the darkness. I asked him what he's doing out here so late. He said something along the lines of, "None of your darn business." He glanced behind me for a moment. Instinctively, I turned around, grabbing my sister's hand and running all the way back to the campsite. My sister and I dived into my tent since I left it unzipped. I could hear footsteps around the campsite. My heart sank when I heard a knife gliding across my tent. The two of us backed up against the other side of it. I reached for my rifle, but then the knife stopped. Someone outside laughed. Then whoever it was cut the tent open. One of those two men tried to climb inside, but I kicked at them, and my sister screamed. Everyone in the campsite woke up. They came rushing over, but those two men left right away. We called 911 and a ranger. The area was searched. They found the two guys, and worst of all, they found two bodies of missing people. That's as far as I can comfortably say with this story, except one last thing. My family and I never went camping again after that. That brings us to the end of this episode of Darkness Prevails. More terrifying stories are on the way soon, so subscribe and smash that like button. By the way, did you know this show is available as a podcast called Unexplained Encounters? Just search for, follow, and rate Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. This show is part of the EerieCast network. Go to EerieCast.com for more scary podcasts, such as Freaky Folklore, which explores your favorite monsters, myths, and mysteries, as well as Redwood Bureau, a fictional horror podcast about an agent on the run from an evil secret organization that captures supernatural creatures and entities. Well, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.
G'day mates, it's B-Buster here, and I would like to give Thrive Market a huge shout out for sponsoring this episode. So a few weeks back, I became a Thrive Market member. They're delivering organic and sustainable groceries right to my door. I've actually gotten one of their custom meat and seafood boxes, and also the new Primal Buffalo sauce to restock some of my cupboards at my place, and also give the sauce a try. And honestly, I can't imagine shopping for meat any other way. But once you try Thrive Market, you'll love it as much as I do. Here's why. So as a proud Thrive Market member, I get the products that I love, and my paid membership provides a free one for someone in need, like a low-income family, a teacher, a veteran, or a first responder or something. Thrive Market tailors to over 70 different diets and values like paleo, keto, or plant-based, delivering the highest quality organic and sustainable essentials from groceries, healthy snacks, meat and seafood, clean wines, non-toxic cleaning, and even bath and body. As a member, I'm saving 25 to 50% off traditional retail prices, and their carbon-neutral shipping is free on orders over $49. The savings I get on my favorite clean organic products are amazing, but I also feel good about helping to support communities in need. And in addition to membership matching, Thrive Market has raised over $750,000 to date through their COVID-19 relief fund. So, go to thrivemarket.com/scared, join today, and you'll get a free gift of your choosing up to $22 in value. That's THRIVE market.com/scared to start your risk-free membership and get a free gift today. thrivemarket.com/scared. My family and I had just come home from staying in a small house near the Redwoods in CA, and immediately after arriving home, everyone decides to sleep since it's very late. After everyone is asleep, I hear a noise in the basement though, so I head down there, cracking the door open, how I always do. That's when I hear the noise again behind me, sounding like someone gasping for air. Turning around quickly, I see a woman with long black hair, pale white skin, and a white gown soaking wet as if she had just gone for a swim, completely clothed. She opens her mouth, making one more loud gasp for air. Then I woke up, realizing that it was just a dream. The next day, my father tells me how, after I went to sleep last night, the security system started acting up. It was not letting him engage because it claimed that the basement door was cracked open. Even after he made sure that it was closed, it was still going off though. My mother later that day told me around 3:30 that she woke up and decided to get some water, and going out into the kitchen, she sees the basement door propped open. Being the only person that does this, she asked if it was me, and I tend to sleepwalk sometimes, but my smartwatch says that I never left my bed that night. Anyway, 3 months after this, I was looking up the history of that house, and I came across a triple homicide plus suicide case. This took place 9 months before we visited, and it stated a father took his wife out to the house's private pond, then wrapped his hands around her neck, forcing her down in the water. After he lured out his 2 young daughters, he drowned them too, and he finished it off and blew his own brains out. Apparently, the neighbor's CCTV footage caught it all, and to this day, I can still hear a very loud scratching and opening of the basement door while I'm awake in my bed. It's genuinely terrifying, and thankfully nothing else has happened so far, but I don't know. What do you guys think? So this is a short one, but it's something that's never left me. It happened when I was 12 or 13 years old. We were visiting our ex-neighbors and took our 2 little dogs with us. At some point after lunch, our parents asked my friend and I to take the dog out for a walk. While on our way back to the apartment, we saw a creepy dude sort of walking in our direction. His behavior was really weird too, sort of whistling very suspiciously, looking at the sky with a terrifying grin on his face. I knew that it was bad the second my dogs were growling and barking at him too, way before he even got near us. I mean, they just never do this. They're just so nice and sweet, and I even suspect that they would even greet a thief breaking into our home nicely. But anyway, we naturally ran away and we got back home quickly. We later found out, though, that turns out this guy was known in the neighborhood for being a pedophile and had several other mental health issues. And chances are that we got out of there in the nick of time. For some backstory, I've always been interested in paranormal activity. It terrifies me, but fascinates me all at the same time, and I've always felt sensitive to it, I suppose. I'm the first one to sort of notice cold spots or energy that just feels different or off in the house, and I've had many personal encounters with activity. But when I was a kid, my parents finally found a deal that worked for them on a good-sized home after months and months of searching. We were not wealthy by any stretch of the word, and my mum was about 7 months pregnant with my little sister, so she wasn't working a lot. We also had my two stepsisters from my dad's previous marriage that would come and stay with us occasionally, and it was always a struggle in the smaller duplexes and trailers that we lived in prior. So, when my parents were able to afford a 3-story house, they were elated. Obviously, too, I'm getting this part of the portion of the story from them, but they said that when they went to look at the house, they just immediately felt uneasy. It was a wide-open living dining area, but they felt very claustrophobic and sort of short of breath. They felt that they were being watched and had extreme waves of paranoia and anxiety, but they chalked it up to being emotionally overwhelmed due to the recent financial struggles. And in the end, they were just so excited to have the place that they completely ignored their gut instinct and they closed the deal. And so, in we went. On move-in day, we walk through the front door, and the very first thing that we see is one window in the living room just completely covered in flies. None flying through the room, none on any other windows, and there were so many that only a couple of rays of light were peering through. My dad thought that there must be a dead animal outside, so we went out to look, but there was no carcass or anything. In fact, he had to come and sort of scrape them off the window himself. But we get moved in, and the first few nights were relatively calm, if I'm being honest. I remember hearing a few creaks and moans, but the house was old, so my parents reassured me that it was just the wood. But then my cat started acting really weird. For instance, one night she was on my mum's lap just relaxing, and out of nowhere she just bolts up to all fours, back lurched up to the ceiling, and starts hissing at absolutely nothing. But there was nobody in the room, and my dog was downstairs, but she was just staring at the top of our staircase like she was about to attack something, but there was nothing there. My mum was pretty freaked out, but she brushed it off, and she went back to watching TV, and my cat went to the stairs. The stairs were sort of tiered, so there were 4 at the bottom, and they leveled out to a little platform, and then there were about 20 that led to our bedrooms upstairs. My cat walked to the top and immediately just froze, almost like she was taxidermied, and all of a sudden she just flies off the stairs. She didn't jump, mind you, and she definitely didn't fall. But there was just no way with the trajectory and how she was there and whatnot that she could have flown this way, but it was honestly like she was thrown from there. In fact, it sort of looked like something kicked her off the top as hard as it could. She didn't touch the ground until about 15 stairs down, and then just scampered off into the kitchen and didn't leave for the rest of the night. And my mum lost her mind at that, and called my dad, who came in and consoled her, and they went to bed. Fast forward to winter though, and we have our dog in our basement. She was an outside dog by choice, and we would let her out to the potty and bring her in, and not 30 seconds later, she would just whine to go back out. She roamed our backyard, which was plenty spacious. She was the sweetest dog I ever met. No bias, too. Never so much as growled at anyone. Every person that she met pretty much was just her best friend. She was also very energetic, though, and the basement housed all of my dad's work tools at one end, so we had her on a chain that was just long enough to let her get to every part of the basement, but that little corner because we didn't want her messing up my dad's stuff. But one night, my dad went down to check on her and spend some time with her. We had a door that opened to a small staircase down in the basement, and as soon as my dad saw her, he knew that something just wasn't right. She was at the end of her chain, pulling so hard that she was almost choking herself. Every hair on her back was on end, and she was growling as loud as she could, and my dad said that he'd never seen a dog that angry before. And this is a dog that he's known since she was born, so she knows him, and she didn't think that he was a stranger. But she was snarling and drooling, and my dad said that she wasn't looking at him, but behind him like he was invisible. My dad is a tough-as-nails Missouri redneck, too. Never been scared of pretty much anything a day in his life, but that day I saw genuine fear in his eyes. He came back up, pale as a cloud with the dog, and said that something in this house did not want us here. Over the next few months, we had a sort of smattering of activity. We heard whistling at night, someone would knock on the door, but there would be nobody there. Out of nowhere, we would smell the overwhelming scent of fresh roses. One night we were playing hide and seek and my sister hid in the closet, just big enough for her to fit in with those weird sort of accordion doors, so no lock or anything, and I walked by and heard her giggling, so I told her that I found you and went to open the door, but I couldn't. She thought that I was joking at first, and I was young, I'll admit, but not young enough to not be able to open an accordion door. She started yelling for me to let her out, but for the life of me, I just could not get this door open. I yelled for my dad, and he came to try, and lo and behold, he couldn't open it either. And it was honestly like someone was holding it shut. Again, though, my dad is tough as nails, and a complete hillbilly redneck, and he's a strong guy. And he was yanking on this door with all of his strength, but he just couldn't get it open for the life of him. It got to the point, in fact, where we had to tear apart the door with a hammer to use the knob on the inside. Eventually, we were all so terrified of this place that we called my grandpa to come and bless the house. He was a very spiritual man and had experience with the paranormal and went so far as to get himself ordained. He came with holy water and sage, and he did his thing, but the second that he started, it was like he was just soaking wet with sweat, like he had just run a marathon to get there. He told us right off the bat that something was definitely there, it was not nice, and it didn't want us there. He took about 2 hours and went through the whole house, and when he got to the basement, he hesitated, but he went in anyway, saying that that was the hot spot. We were upstairs while he was down there, but he swore till the day that he died that he saw the shadow of an old man in the corner just staring at him. He was a jokester, but never when it came to his family or their well-being, and he also took this sort of thing very, very seriously. Like I said, he was very spiritual, and this was definitely not his first rodeo. When he finished, though, he said that we should be safe for now, but to look at moving as soon as humanly possible, so that is exactly what we did. We moved not even a month later, and we never thought twice about ever going back. These were my first major experiences with the paranormal, and I've experienced plenty of it since then, but that house will forever stick with me as one of the scariest places that I've ever been to. There was just something really dark there, and I sincerely hope that whoever moved in after us was able to live there safely. If anyone has any questions or wants to talk about other experiences that I've had, then please do ask away, because I might be able to share them in another story here. And of course, I'm more than happy to share them too. Anyway, thanks for listening if you got this far, and I hope you guys have a great week. So, to put it as simply as I can, I was in a very terrifying relationship when I was pretty young. I had actually gotten married when I was 17 to my boyfriend of 3 years, and I'm just going to call him Dave, but Dave was a complete psycho. He was obsessed with blood, occult things, and Charles Manson even. He always talked about how if I left him to watch out for missing redheads on the news because he was going to find me and Ted Bundy me. And when I did finally leave him, it was really scary. He tried to end his own life. He totally tore his own arm open and wrote my name in his blood on our sheets and on my wall. I still had to stay there for a few days to pack my things, though, and I was terrified that he was going to kill me or himself. He kept saying things like, "If I can't have you, then no one can, and in another world together we can try again." What the heck, right? And I would also wake up to him standing over my bed while I was sleeping. But one night, a night that I'll never forget, I woke up to the sound of him saying, "If I can't have her, then no one can." I froze, and I was scared because something was different about this time. I peeked my eyes open, but not enough to where he would know that I was awake. He was standing over me with a huge knife from our kitchen, and was tracing the tip of the knife up and down on his arm and whispering things to himself. I instantly turned toward him and opened my eyes, and we made eye contact. He stopped whispering. He started to walk toward me, and I just said, "Please don't." He stopped. He stared at me for a while and then walked to the stairs or the door of my room. He turned around at the door and stared at me for a while again with the knife in his hands, and I didn't know if I was going to die or if it was him or not, but after a few minutes, he just walked down the stairs and he went to sleep. I'm a 31-year-old woman, and this happened a few years back. I was walking from a friend's house to meet my son's father, ex, at a bar that we frequented in those days. It was winter, icy and snowing with giant piles of snow all around. I was walking from a friend's house around 9 p.m. down an alley that served as a driveway area for many houses. Not a great neighborhood by any means, but not particularly bad either. I was wearing my apocalypse boots, waterproof, knee-high, winterproof, and I usually have headphones in blaring music while I walk, but that night, for some reason, I can't remember, I just decided not to. And in hindsight, that may have been the very thing that saved me. So I'm about the equivalent of 2 to 3 blocks away from the bar. There's a younger guy, early 20s, walking about 50 feet behind me, and he says, "Hey, you." I turn around. It seems that he's talking to somebody else. "Hey." I look back, then continue walking. "Yeah, you. No, don't turn around, sweetheart." I start to walk faster as I realize that he's getting closer. Ahead of me, I see an SUV running, backed out of a parking spot, but blocking my path, and I turn around, and there's another guy. The door to the SUV opens, and there's a couple of guys in it looking at me. One gets out and stands by the open door. I turn to look at the guy behind me, when out of nowhere, about 5 more guys come out, surrounding me from a distance, slowly closing in. The realization that they were hiding behind piles of plowed snow hits me, and I realized that they were just standing and watching me. A couple of them had their phones out and were recording something that was about to go down. Nobody was smiling, but they were closing in on me, trying to get me to walk to the SUV. Fight or flight kicked in though, and I just decided that I didn't want to know what was about to happen to me. I wanted to catch them off guard, so instead of running forward, I bolted to the left. And thank God for those boots, I could run across the ice no problem. I ended up cutting through a few yards and made it to the bar, and eventually I got away. But if it weren't for the fact that that ice was so slippery and I had those boots on, I think that I would have been done for. I would like to start this off by saying that this actually took place a few years ago, but seemed relevant to share here because, well, a lot of people are doing online dating right now. So one summer when I was in law school, I was swiping through Tinder just looking for someone to hang out with. I matched with this guy who seemed pretty nice and looked good. Lots of shirtless photos if you catch my drift, and he was a counselor at a local high school in the metro area. We texted for a while, talked on the phone, and then decided to grab brunch the next weekend. I met him at the restaurant, and we had brunch. He was nice, funny, made me laugh a lot. I think we both got a little bit tipsy, and he said that he was going back to a barbecue at his friend's house after brunch and asked me to come with him. He seemed pretty cool, and I was having a good time, so I agreed. I had to walk my dog because I hadn't anticipated being out that long, so I told him that I would meet him back at the restaurant in 30 minutes. He said that he really wanted to meet my dog and asked if he could come walk the dog with me, and I sort of thought about it for a second, but my place was just a total disaster, so I told him no in the end. But eventually I came back to the restaurant and we grabbed an Uber to his friend's house. There were a bunch of people drinking and talking, and everyone was nice. They had the barbecue situation going on out back, and we talked to some people and hung out, drank. He started to get drunk and also handsy, so I told him that I wanted to drink and walked into the kitchen for some space. A couple of minutes later, he comes into the kitchen and tries to kiss me. I kind of smiled at this and shrugged my way out of his grasp, and I told him that I needed to go to the bathroom. I asked him to grab me a drink and meet me outside in the backyard, and When I left the restroom, I just walked straight out the front door, 2 blocks down, and I took a right. I grabbed an Uber home and I started getting calls and texts, but I blocked him. He tried to reach out over social media, but I also blocked him there too, and I pretty much totally forgot about him. But fast forward 3 years, I'm sitting on the couch just sort of chilling, reading through the local news on my phone, and I scroll and see a picture of this guy's face again. And he had been arrested for raping women that he met on Tinder all these years. So I was on holidays with my family at my grandparents' house. I must have been 10 or 11 years old. When me and my family go to our grandparents, we often aren't the only ones visiting too. My uncles and their families often also visit my grandparents at the same time as us, so basically, I get to see my whole family. Because of that, it almost never happens that I'm home alone. But there was this one night where I got left home alone because of 2 emergencies. My grandmother and my aunt both had to go to hospital, and my whole family went with them, except for me. I was sick, so I told them that I wasn't feeling healthy enough to go for a 1-hour drive. My grandmother told me that the dog would keep me safe if something happened, and got the whole family out of the house. After they left, I got on my PlayStation 2 and I played some racing games. I can't remember which one exactly, but after some time I heard my dog barking outside. At first I thought that she might be barking at the moon or something, since she does that from time to time. After about 15 minutes, I went outside to check up on her to see if she was maybe hungry or something. But she was right outside, just barking at the living room that was next to the room that I was playing in. I tried to calm her down and get her some treats and water, but she just kind of looked at me and let out a very small cry. After that, she just kept barking at the living room. I just left her to do so, since she didn't want to listen to me, and I wasn't that bothered about it. I got back on my PlayStation and tried to get back in the zone, but after about 10 minutes or so, I heard some really loud noises coming from the room next door, and my dog stopped barking and just started crying out for me. I went outside to get him and check out what the hell was happening, but when I looked inside, I saw something that made my heart stop almost. The couches were just flipped back or stood at random places where they shouldn't be. Chairs were broken, paintings on the ground, and some of the light bulbs were completely shattered. Upon seeing this, I closed the door quickly and I ran into my grandparents' room waiting for them to get home. As soon as they got home, I tried to tell my mum what had happened, but she just looked at me and told me that I'm in big trouble for what I've done with the place and that I'll never be left alone again. I tried to convince her that it wasn't me, but she just didn't want to listen to what I had to say. The weird thing is that my family never spoke to me about that night again, and I expected for someone to ask me why I messed up the living room or why I did what I did, but not a single person mentioned that night again. Which means that either they believed me and realized that a 10-year-old kid just wouldn't be able to mess up a room that bad, or they just were really mad at me and didn't want me to keep lying to them. So this happened last night. I, a 25 female, live alone in an apartment in a not very good part of my city. I was lying in bed just watching Criminal Minds when the phone to the door to my apartment complex rang. It's a locked door, so visitors have to be let in, and it rang 4 or 5 times. I wasn't really expecting anyone. It was about 10 p.m. at this point, so I didn't open the door or answer the door phone. I called my mum and I told her that I felt a bit scared. I have a history of abusive relationships and I've been diagnosed with PTSD. My mum told me that it was probably just a neighbour who forgot their key or something, but then I heard the elevator come up, so I went to look through the peephole in my door, and I saw a man in dark clothes and a hoodie get out of the elevator and walk towards my door. Upon seeing this, I freaked out and I told my mum, who I still had on the phone. She told me to step away from the door, so I went into my bedroom, and that was when the man started to pull on the door handle and then proceeded to pound on the door. I was really freaking out at this point, whispering to my mum what was happening. She told me to go and lock myself in the bathroom while she called the police on my sister's phone. The police told my mum to tell me to mute my phone and hang up the call with her so that they could call me. I did so, and they called, and they told me to stay locked in the bathroom and to just be quiet. At the same time, I could still hear the man trying to get in, and it was getting pretty violent out there now. The woman told me that a police patrol was only a couple of minutes away. I was in full-blown panic mode at this moment, and after what felt like forever, the woman on the phone told me that 2 police officers were outside my door, so I could go out from the bathroom and open the door for them. I was crying and hyperventilating and just a complete mess when they entered. One of the officers stayed with me in the apartments while the other searched the building. And unfortunately, they never found the man. So here I am today, still freaked out, not knowing who this man was or what he wanted. But I sure hope that he doesn't come back, whoever he is. Back when I was 18, my best friend Anne and I used to go to this club quite frequently. Legal age to drink in my country is 18. It was a pretty trendy place with cheapish drinks and really good music. My dad never stopped me from going clubbing, but he always told me not to get drunk and to be aware of my surroundings, always. My mum always told me to look out for Anne as well, and for Anne to look out for me. Girls need to stick together kind of thing. So, it was an average ladies' night on Wednesday, where girls enter for free and drinks are cheaper. Anne and I start drinking and we get pretty buzzed, but not drunk. Anne needed to go to the bathroom, so I followed her and waited outside. So the male and the female bathrooms are right next to each other, and there's a sofa in the front so people can sit and wait. On the sofa there was a girl who was obviously very, very drunk, and she was in between 2 guys who were laughing, but it just looked a bit off to me. They were kind of harassing her, which could have been mistaken just as 2 friends having a laugh at their female friend being drunk. But they proceeded to literally carry her out of the club. At this stage, Anne comes out, and I mentioned to her that this girl looks like she may be in danger. But we both tail them, and the more that I see them interact with her, the more that I feel that they're just out to sexually assault her or something like that. My friend and I go up to her and say, "Oh my goodness, it's you, Angela. There you are." We didn't know her actual name, but we just wanted to get her out of that situation. The guys were shocked and they put her down. Anne asks them who they are, and they claim that they were trying to help her and bring her out of the club for some fresh air. I wanted to give them a piece of my mind, but somehow I read Anne's mind and just decided against it. We were 2 18-year-old girls, and they were 2 large 25-plus-year-old guys. We wanted to save the girl, but we didn't want to jeopardize our own safety either. So we pull her away and put our arms around her shoulders, and we carry her outside of the club ourselves. We're trying to ask her if she has ID on her, or if she has friends at the club also, and she was just way too drunk to answer. We finally got outside and saw a small group of guys and girls around this girl's age, and they see us and they run toward us and her, and they were her friends. The girls in the group take her from me and Anne and start talking to her in their own language. The guys thank us profusely, and we explain that we found her inside. We later learn that they were German tourists and their first time in our country as well. It still haunts me, though, to this day on what could have happened if we didn't intervene and save Angela like we did. Remember to please be safe out there, guys, and drink responsibly, and always have a friend with you when you're not. But look out for other girls too, because we need each other. One evening, my mum asked me to go get some bread and milk from the nearest convenience store, which was about a 10-minute walk away. Walking there wasn't a problem as the sun was still out, but it was just starting to set. I went on the main road and there were cars, many cars in fact, and people going past as well. I bought the stuff my mum asked me to get and I started making my way home. But the walk home was different. This time, I decided to take the back road. I just felt like going down the quiet route for whatever reason, and so there I was walking, when a van with tinted windows, yes, I know, very cliché, pulled up next to me. In the driver's seat was a man that asked me for directions somewhere, so I told him. He came up with some stupid excuse that he didn't know where it was and wanted me to come with him. I'm not stupid, so this was obviously a giant red flag for me. I told him no and that I was expected to be home soon. But the man kept trying to persuade me to go with him so I can show him the way. And apparently, him and I arguing was meant to distract me from the fact that there were other men outside the van who had silently opened the door and tried to get behind so that they could grab me and drag me into their van. But I noticed something move behind me and that there's two men coming at me from both directions. I shrieked and I don't even know how I escaped, but somehow I outran two fully grown men like Usain Bolt on crack. As soon as I saw these two men, I just bolted as fast as I could and they did too. I found the nearest alleyway to the main road, and I found a woman walking her dog not too far in front of me, so I decided to catch up with her and start petting her dog to kind of let the men know that I wasn't alone, if that makes sense. When I turned my head around, I saw the two men on the end of the alleyway looking at me, and they both just ran off, back into the alleyway, into, I assume, their van. I started running home, acting normal like nothing happened too when I got there, but I just, honestly, wanted to cry on the inside. So I'm a 16-year-old teen at the time, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and attending my first folk festival with a friend and her family. I'm a totally naive little white girl, completely smitten with the whole hippie thing, thinking that I'm so evolved and edgy like everyone else there. Cringe, I know. There was dancing, music, attractive people, and an unspoken and assumed kindness, empathy, and trust amongst total strangers there. Very anti-establishment and anti-individualistic mind frame, but also very anti-stranger danger because love is everywhere and everyone is connected and we're all valued and safe and blah blah blah. You know how it goes. Anyway, I was separated from my friend at the time and walking to the festival from the campground when a tall slim white man in a white robe approached me and started chatting me up. He was weird immediately, but it was a folk music festival. Weird is normal, and normal is weird here, and I'm an impressionable young girl desperately seeking approval. And he told me that I was beautiful, and asked me where I was from, and I told him a small town about an hour away. It didn't say the name. And he told me that he was from the States, and that his name was James in the Rain, and handed me his card. He gave it to me in the event that I'd be interested in attending another festival that he puts on in his own community. I took the card and I carried on. Eventually the festival ends, and 4 days after I've been at home. I'm at work, just slicing meat in a deli. James in the Rain enters the store, and he immediately notices the wristband still on my wrist and says, "You're the girl from the festival." He continues to talk to me, doesn't buy anything, and even follows me up to the cash register to talk to me about random things while I'm just trying to serve other customers. At this point, I must admit that I was creeped out, and really I just wanted him to leave. He wouldn't leave though until I gave him a hug, so I gave him a hug so that he would leave me alone, and then he left. Later on though, I told my mum what had happened, and she actually looked him up on Google, and it turns out that this guy is a part of some commune called Rainbow People who recruit young women and brainwash them into leaving their families, forcing them to cut off all ties with their world and join their community up in the mountains. And how he figured out where I work now has me a little bit worried. This happened 15 years ago when I was 19. At the time, I worked on a cargo vessel, and this was my third trip to sea. The ship was around 30 years old when I was on board, which doesn't sound old, but it's pretty old for a ship. The vessel had been refitted a few times by the time that I was on board as well. I won't say the name of the ship, as I'll be naming people by position, so it would potentially lead to people being identified. For anyone who works in similar jobs, though, you'll know that it's like being the young, relatively new guy on an all-male team with people who've lived and worked together for months or even years. And in essence, you feel like a bit of an outsider and have to prove your worth, and also you can expect to have a load of practical jokes played on you. So, you can imagine when I joined this ship, and the guys are all talking about a ghost on board, I was like, yeah, whatever. They asked me if I believed in ghosts, and I said no, which was actually a lie, as I had experienced things before. But anyway, they basically just said something like, "You will soon," and I just laughed it off. I think I'd been on board for about maybe a week, I think, when I first heard a loud knock at the cabin door. I had my own cabin, but it was a small one in the middle of the accommodation, with no porthole. So I opened the door, and there was nobody there. I definitely thought that I was getting pranked, and this started happening regularly, and it would be at all sorts of times, often waking me up while I was sleeping with 3 loud knocks. And every time I tried to jump up and open the door as quickly as possible to catch the person, but I never saw anyone or even heard them running away or anything. Now, my cabin was roughly in the middle of a corridor. I'd say was around 20 meters long, so you'd have to run 10 meters to get around a corner. And a few times too, I honestly felt like I'd opened the door quick enough that I should have seen someone. This got me thinking, though, that maybe there was someone in a neighboring cabin. I asked who was in the cabins next to mine. There was an old guy in one cabin who was in his 60s, and I'd never seen him move fast enough. The others were empty. This is quite common in older ships, as they used to get built to house more crew, but ships sail with less and less crew these days. And so, the knocking just continued. Until one day when I was at my wardrobe just hanging my shirt up, when literally I was right next to the cabin door when it knocked. I opened it so fast that I definitely should have been face to face with them. But when I did, the corridor was empty. I think that's when I realized too that there was something else going on here. After that though, I started taking more notice of what other people were saying, and I also started paying attention to the oppressive feeling on board. I'd been on 2 ships previously, and I sailed on 4, more after this one too, and none had an atmosphere like that. Things got worse after that too. Now, one of my jobs at night would be making rounds of the ship to check the cargo was secured, and there's no problems and whatnot. You take a radio with you so you can radio the bridge if you need to, and the radio would just sometimes loudly blast static for no reason. And if I radioed the officer on the bridge to ask if they said something, they would come back clear and say no, and there was no static for them. This happened with multiple radios, so it wasn't a dud as well. Now, one day on my rounds, I was in the laundry at 2 a.m. just making checks, and an alarm sounded, and I spun around to see the watertight door just closing behind me. I radioed the bridge and asked if they were closing it, which would be unusual as they only get operated in tests and emergencies. The second mate said no, and on his console it was showing open. But the door closed all the way, and the second mate radios to tell me to try and manually override, as he can't do it from the bridge as it still says open. I use the lever to override and open the door. I radio to tell the mate, and he says he'll get it looked at by the engineers. I carry on with my rounds, and as I approach the next door, the alarm sounds and it starts closing again. I radio the mate, and he says he's not going to do anything, and I'll just have to override again. This time I get it open, and as soon as it's fully open, it starts to close again. I look around, and the other door is also now closing. At this point, I'm getting shut into the laundry, and I get this really weird feeling of just impending doom. And it was right about that time when the lights begin to flicker and static just blasts straight over the radio. I jump through the closing door, a really bad idea because they can crush you, and I just noped the hell out of there. Now, theoretically, that could all be a coincidence of failing systems or someone playing tricks. The doors can be controlled from the bridge, but it's just not something someone would do as a prank since they can actually kill you. Also, when the door started closing, no one would have known that I was there. It was just me and the second mate and an engineer awake at the time, and there were no cameras. They did a full watertight door test the next day, and they also just found no faults. I should mention that watertight doors are each controlled by an independent system, so if one fails, they don't all fail, meaning that 2 doors experiencing faults together would be incredibly unlikely, to say the least. After that, though, I just never went into the laundry alone again. On another night, I did my late night rounds as usual and reported back up to the bridge when I finished. But when I got there, the second mate was white as a sheet and shaking. He was holding a cup of tea that was sloshing about from how much his hand was shaking, and I asked if he was okay, and he could barely speak. Finally, he managed to tell me that he was sat in front of the radar screen 5 minutes earlier when he heard me come back to the bridge. He asked if everything was okay, and I didn't respond. He looked over his shoulder, back at me, but instead, it was an old guy, pale and wide-eyed, just staring down at him from just arm's length away. He literally fell off his chair, and the old guy just disappeared in front of his eyes. He said the worst thing was the expression of just malice on his face of this old guy as well. The second mate was weeping as he told me this as well, and he was a pretty tough guy, so I believed it. But the worst experience was definitely in my cabin. So I'd been on board maybe 3 months by this point, and had kind of accepted that I was stuck on this messed up ship. I guess some of the fear had gone as you get used to being on edge like that eventually, and I ignored my door knocking by this point. It might have even stopped happening, I can't really recall, but anyway, I get into bed one night, read for a bit, and I turn the light off. As soon as I turn the light off though, I think I see a figure stood over the bed, but it's pretty much pitch black, so I can't make out any detail. And after initially jumping, I reprimand myself for being silly and assume it's just my eyes adjusting. But then, the figure sits down on the bed, squashing my legs and turning its head towards me. Now, I can literally hear you guys screaming sleep paralysis at me right now, but I've experienced it before, and I can tell you that this wasn't that. I could move my arms and my upper body just fine, and I could move my feet, but my lower legs were trapped by the weight of something. I was frantically pulling at the blankets to try and dislodge this thing and get my legs out, but it was just impossible. I tried to reach for the light switch, but it was just a couple of inches out of reach. I started full-on swinging at the space where it should be sat, but my hands just didn't hit anything. I started screaming at this thing over and over again to get off me, and eventually the figure stood up and I could move my legs again. I hit the light, and when I did, there was nothing there. I'll be honest with you guys too, that I couldn't sleep without copious amounts of alcohol and a nightlight after that, and even for a bit after I left the ship, which, as you can imagine, was awesome for picking up girls in my early 20s. Hey, want to come around and stay over? Excuse me while I get myself plastered and turn my nightlight on. Multiple other things happened after this too, but this is already getting pretty long, so I'll skip ahead to the last big thing with multiple witnesses. So when I'd been in that ship about 5 months, me and the night watch were in the crew bar after our watch finished, probably at about 4 a.m. I was about to begin my routine of getting so drunk that I'd pass out and not care if a ghost sat on me or whatever, basically. We were talking about some of the weird stuff that we'd seen on board. It was me, the second mate, the second engineer, and a grease monkey, engineer lackey basically, and as we were talking, one of the guys looks across the bar and says, "What the hell?" And his mouth is open like an O, and we all look where he's looking, and a Henry Hoover is just floating about 2 foot off the floor with its stupid smiley face just looking at us. The second mate just swears in like an incredulous manner, and the Hoover gets thrown a few feet off to the left instead of just getting dropped. Obviously, we called it a short night after that one.
Before the video starts, just a quick reminder to go check out the Chilling app. If you can't get enough content from me here on this channel, myself and other narrators here on YouTube are providing hours of unique and spine-tingling scary story narrations exclusively over on Chilling. There's new narrations from me added weekly, and there's new professional narrators constantly being added to the list. There's literally hundreds of hours of scary stories to binge on, from monsters, paranormal, thrillers, and true scary stories. The Chilling app even has classic novels, true crime stories, and chilling original series. And this all can be enjoyed with their one-of-a-kind ambient menu, where you can mix in immersive and relaxing sound effects like a crackling fire, dark storms, and chill rain, and adjust their volumes independently and a sleep timer so you can drift off to dreamland without interruptions after. And guess what? They just added the ability to download stories you're listening to, so you can listen offline now as well. Click the link in the description or the pinned comment to try the free trial of the Chilling app, and after that it's only $2.99 a month, which makes it completely ad and interruption free. Also, before I forget, April 22nd marks 1 year since we launched Chilling, and they're doing a huge giveaway of a Samsung 70-inch Class 7 Series LED 4K UHD Smart TV, along with a Samsung 4.1 channel soundbar and a limited edition Chilling Year 1 t-shirt. 2 first-place runners-up will receive a $100 gift card to Amazon and a limited edition Chilling Year 1 t-shirt, and 5 second-place runners-up will receive a $25 gift card to Amazon and a limited edition Chilling Year 1 t-shirt. The winner will be announced on May 2nd, and you can find details in the links in the description or pinned comment below. Now on to the stories. Randall Smith was raised as an only child in the small town of Pearisburg, Virginia. The townsfolk remembered his mother as a nice lady who kept to herself, earning a living in a laundry room at the Giles Memorial Hospital. But, for some reason, for the first few years of his life, Randall's mother chose to dress him in girls' clothing. We can only speculate as to the effect this had on the young man, but what we do know is that his schoolmates would later describe him as something of a loner, as well as a habitual liar. He often told tales of money he didn't have or of spurious-sounding adventures he'd been on. This led his peers to calling him LR, an acronym standing for Lying Randall. During his youth, Randall would often go walking the Appalachian Trail alone, finding solace in the rolling hills and deep primordial forests. After high school, Randall earned a living doing odd jobs around Virginia. Some might have fretted at the instability, but Randall relished it, as it gave him the freedom to ramble where he liked. And just like in his youth, he would spend the majority of his spare time wandering the Appalachian Trail, sometimes disappearing for days at a time. The trail stretches for just over 2,000 miles from Georgia to Maine and attracts thousands of hikers every single year, most of which see the trail as a kind of rite of passage for serious hill walkers. Most use the trail as a means of escaping their busy workday lives, taking comfort in the peace and serenity of nature. But at times, there have been a number of hideously violent crimes committed in the area. Perhaps the most infamous being the 2008 abduction and murder of Meredith Emerson by a psychopath drifter named Michael Hilton, which took place in a region known as Blood Mountain. During the spring of 1981, 2 27-year-old social workers from Maine by the names of Susan Ramsey and Robert Mountford decided to hike through Appalachia to raise money for a mental illness charity. On their travels, they had made friends with another hiker on the trail, but had to part ways shortly afterward. However, they had agreed to meet up in Pearisburg, Randall Smith's hometown, to catch up and grab a bite to eat together. But when Susan and Robert failed to show up to the meeting, their hiker friend became concerned and contacted the police to report them missing. Deputy Sheriff Tom Lawson gathered up a handful of other deputies and then went up onto the trail to begin the search. On the way, they spoke to a number of other hikers, asking each if they had seen anyone fitting the missing couple's descriptions. Most said no, but one group said yes, reporting that they had seen a man and a woman talking with a rather strange-looking individual who seemed to be acting in a bizarre manner near the Wapiti shelter, a small log structure that had been constructed so that wary hikers could rest a while before continuing down the trail. The deputies headed straight for the shelter, finally reaching it on May 30th of 1981. By that time, it had been 11 days since the last sightings of the missing hikers, and unless they were experienced in bushcraft, the chance of them reappearing unharmed were rapidly dwindling. While searching the small wooden structure, one of the deputies noticed what appeared to be a blood stain on one of the floorboards. The men then fanned out, searching the area intensively until they came across a small clearing that contained a pile of leaves, one that looked like an attempt to cover something up. They kicked away the leaves, revealing a cloth sleeping bag that had a large, heavy mass inside of it. When they cut it open, they discovered it was the corpse of Susan Ramsey, the female half of the charity hiking couple. A day later, with the help of a sniffer dog, the body of Robert Mountford was found buried near a tree stump, also wrapped up in a sleeping bag. Robert had a single bullet wound to his head, fired from a .22 caliber pistol, while Susan had been stabbed several times before being bludgeoned to death. Their bodies then dragged from the Wapiti shelter to the spots that they were buried. Nearby, deputies found Susan's camera. They had hoped that the film might contain clues to who had murdered them, but found it had been pulled out and stolen. However, Susan's backpack was also found, a backpack which contained a paperback book that was taken for fingerprint analysis. Most of the prints obviously belonged to Susan, but one set belonged to someone else entirely. Investigators initially believed they belonged to Robert Mountford, but were shocked to find that they did in fact belong to none other than lying Randall Smith. Sheriff deputies immediately traveled to Randall's home. He wasn't around, but the deputies had a search warrant and smashed their way into his place to make some seriously disturbing discoveries. Not only did they find bloody clothes and some items which evidently belonged to the murdered hikers, they also found a great deal of pornographic materials and, most disturbingly, some hospital instruments that apparently been fashioned into makeshift toys. Deputies also found a handwritten note stating that he had been kidnapped and was going to be executed. But analysis showed that this had been written in Randall's own handwriting and was no doubt merely an attempt to throw the police off his scent. The race was on to find him before he could hurt anyone else. Days passed and police had no luck in locating Randall Smith. All of his usual haunts reported that he had not been seen in days, with rangers and police scouring the Virginia section of the Appalachian Trail with absolutely nothing to show for it either. The effort was exhausting, and Deputy Sheriff Tom Lawson found himself needing a break. So he took his family on a brief vacation down to Myrtle Beach in South Carolina. But in some bizarre twist of fate, Deputy Lawson ended up getting a call from the department back home, saying there had been an arrest in South Carolina of a man that was strongly suspected to be involved in the hikers' murders, an arrest in Myrtle Beach, of all places. Deputy Lawson hurried to check the suspect out. When he arrived, he was told that the arrested man claimed to have amnesia and could not remember his name or how he ended up in Myrtle Beach, but that he was covered in insect bites in a way that was consistent with someone having hiked the Appalachian Trail for days on end. Insect bites that had been scratched so much that they were in danger of becoming infected. In order to get the man to reveal his identity, the deputies hatched a cunning scheme. They told the man that they could not get him the medical assistance he required without a medical consent form that he was required to sign. When given the form, the man scratched out a name onto the paper. Randall Lee Smith, he wrote. The police had found their man. Randall Smith was just 27 years old when he was extradited back to Virginia on charges of first-degree murder. At first, it seemed as if Randall would get the death penalty if convicted, but in a strange turn of events, he accepted a plea bargain that resulted in him getting a 30-year sentence instead of being executed. One of the victim's fathers was an Episcopalian minister who accepted the use of the plea bargain and was generally against the idea of Randall being executed. It was also thought that the plea bargain was the better option, seeing as there was a complete lack of motive in the killing, with prosecutors believing that this would weaken their argument in the event of a trial. The resulting reduced sentence caused outrage among the local community and fury among hikers nationwide. Out of a 30-year sentence, Randall Smith only ended up serving 15 and was released in 1996 after reportedly being a model inmate who never caused any problems in prison. He walked out of prison a self-confessed murderer but a free man and returned to Parisburg as a pariah. Randall lived with his mother until her death in the year 2000. After she passed, he became more and more of a recluse, although just like in days gone by, he spent much of his free time up in the Appalachian trails, and on more than one occasion was spotted chatting with hikers who were no doubt completely unaware of who they were talking to. But even if they did know Randall Smith, the murderer, by his image, they may not have recognized him now. By that time he was 54, no longer the portly young man who had been convicted of killing Susan Ramsey and Robert Mountford. He was skinny, pale, and walked with a slight limp, and his time in prison had hardened what had once been boyish, smirking features. Then, in March of 2008, Randall seemed to give up on life entirely. He took all the pictures down from the walls of his mother's home, packed up a few belongings, then walked off into the woods. He took only a few change of clothes, some camping and fishing gear, and Bo, his dog. For all intents and purposes, to the people of Petersburg, Randall Smith had dropped off the face of the earth, there one day, totally vanishing the next. But to them, it was simply one less thing they had to worry about, so barely a peep was raised. A few months later, on May 6th, two fishermen named Scott Johnston and Sean Farmer were catching trout up near their favorite spot on a place called Brushy Mountain. It was a beautiful summer's day, perfect for outdoor activities and feeling a little closer to nature. All was peaceful and serene when suddenly they spotted something coming through the trees towards them. It was a middle-aged man with a slight stoop, one who warmly waved before approaching their campsite. The man introduced himself as Ricky Williams. Scott and Sean followed the unwritten code of Appalachia by inviting Ricky to sit and share a dinner of freshly caught fish. Ricky happily obliged them, explaining that he was starving and that he'd been in the woods for weeks by that point and hadn't eaten substantially in days. Scott and Sean could see that this was no lie. Ricky was pale and skinny, and the dog that accompanied him was evidently equally hungry, with its ribs protruding from its fur. The campsite the three men had dinner at was only a mile and a half away from the Wapiti shelter, the site of the hikers' murders way back in 1981. As they ate, Scott and Sean asked Ricky about his life. Ricky replied that he was graduated top of his class from Virginia Tech University and had gone on to write highly advanced scientific papers for NASA pertaining to complex new methods of spaceflight. He also claimed to be extremely wealthy, owning multiple homes in Florida and South Carolina where he would spend time with his wife, who was a runner-up in several Miss USA pageants. Scott and Sean listened skeptically, recognizing that the man's appearance and his tall tales about a high-flying career were most likely a complete fabrication. To them, it was almost as if the man who sat before them was in the habit of lying. It came so easy to him, like it was second nature. As the hours passed and the sun began to dip below the horizon, Scott and Sean began to wonder why their guest hadn't started to make a move back to his own campsite, which was apparently a few miles further upriver. One of them made a comment that he better head back before the inky black of night had truly descended. Falling and injuring yourself on such a secluded stretch of trail could mean real trouble for even the fittest young man, but death for an old-timer. Ricky stayed for about a half hour longer before finding his feet, thanking Scott and Sean and beckoning his dog to follow. "Come on, Bo." For the man's name was not in fact Ricky Williams. The man's name was Randall Lee Smith, and just as he began to walk away from the campsite of his generous fisherman hosts, he pulled a .22 pistol from his pocket and pulled the trigger 4 times. The first bullet struck Sean in the temple. The second shot slammed into Scott's neck. The men tried to run, but still the shots came. The third tore into Sean's chest cavity, while the fourth hit Scott in the rear of his neck. Blood poured from wounds caused by red-hot lead having ripped through their bodies, but still the fishermen hurtled into the woods for safety. Scott had managed to find cover behind a tree as Sean reached his truck, parked in the grass just a few yards away. But as he climbed into the cab of the vehicle and slammed the door behind him, he saw the face of Randall Smith through the window to his left. Randall raised his .22 pistol, pointed it at Sean's head, and once again pulled the trigger. But no shot rang out. The gun hadn't fired. Randall Smith had run out of bullets. As the potential murderer began to reload the .22 pistol, shotgunned the truck's engine and put the pedal to the metal, screeching towards a nearby road with a bullet wound in his head. When he found the road, his headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of it, but it wasn't Randall Smith. It was his fishing buddy Scott. He had survived his wounds and had cut Sean off at the road in order to escape. Sean threw open the passenger door and Scott dived in, still holding onto the open bullet wound to his neck that leaked fresh blood upon the upholstery. But although they were in the process of escaping certain death, their chances of survival were horrifyingly slim. Scott was bleeding to death from the wound to his throat. Sean had been shot in the head. The nearest hospital was over 30 miles away, and they were driving on an uneven dirt road in the middle of near total darkness. Their headlights, the only thing to guide them, in woods so deep they had no cell reception whatsoever. And to top it all off, Scott had left his truck behind with the keys in the ignition. There was every chance that Randall Smith was following them, having tasted blood, looking to finish them off. It took just 5 minutes for Scott and Shine to find a house with lights on inside, but to them, those 5 minutes felt like an eternity. As they pulled up outside it, Scott leapt from the cab of the truck and began to hammer on the front door, screaming for whoever was inside to call 911. The homeowner, a woman named Melissa Miller, initially thought it might have been some kind of home invasion and was reluctant to actually answer the front door. But when she did, she screamed for her 20-year-old son Randy to fetch some towels before calling 911. 20 minutes passed after the first 911 call and still no ambulance had arrived. There was a pile of blood-soaked towels sitting in front of each wounded man when Scott asked to use the Miller's family phone to call his mother and father. He believed with all of his heart that he'd never see them again, but shortly afterward an ambulance did arrive, and with it came a police officer. The EMTs tried to stabilize both men and ensure that neither would bleed to death in the Miller's family home, but it was impossible, and they soon called for helicopter support to airlift both men to a hospital for emergency surgery. Scott, still bleeding from his neck wound, was loaded onto one of the medevac choppers, by that point convinced that he was going to die. He could think of no other reason for such drastic measures. His life must have been hanging in the balance. His fishing buddy Sean had been shot in the head and chest, but it was he that was being airlifted. If his wounds were more serious than a straight-up headshot, he knew his chances of survival were bleak. As the helicopter took off, he felt his mouth filling with blood and heard one of the EMTs talking over the radio saying she didn't think he was going to make it. He felt himself slipping away and said that at one point he thought he was already dead. But as the helicopter landed in nearby Roanoke and a blast of downdraft from the rotor blades hit him as he was unloaded, he knew he was still alive. Thanks to the swift actions of young Randy Miller, who had not only helped with fetching towels, but had also managed to get a hold of one of Randall Smith's missing posters, the police knew who the shooter was. Later that night, a Virginia state trooper was driving along a road about 8 miles away from Petersburg when he spotted Scott's stolen gray truck going in the opposite direction. The trooper turned in the road, turning on his lights, and the truck picked up speed dramatically in an attempt to evade him. But in his frenzied effort to escape justice, Randall Smith ran the truck off the road and flipped it upside down. The trooper pulled up alongside the overturned truck with his gun drawn, while Smith was still strapped inside of it, the same .22 he had tried to kill Scott and Sean with lying on the ceiling of the truck cab just out of reach. The trooper caught a glimpse of Randall's eyes with his flashlight and later described them as the coldest he'd ever seen. In a chilling twist of fate, the unconscious murderer was then taken to the very same hospital that Scott and Sean had been airlifted to, and when he awoke, tried to claim the shootings were in self-defense. When Randall was well enough to be transported, he was taken to the medical wing of the New River Valley Regional Jail in Dublin on May 9, 2008. Then a few days later, a jail officer went to give Randall his dinner, but when the crazed killer didn't retrieve his meal, the officer called his name once, then twice, but there was no answer. The officer went to unlock the cell door, finding Randall lying unconscious on the floor in front of him. Medical staff hurried to revive him, but their attempts were in vain, and shortly afterward, Randall Lee Smith was pronounced dead at the age of 54 years old. Forensic analysis showed that there were no obvious signs of foul play. There were no marks on his body whatsoever, and in all likelihood, Randall had simply died of natural causes. So distraught at the prospect of spending more time in prison, so disappointed that his victims had survived the attack and deprived him of the thrill of killing, that he had simply given up on living. His funeral service lasted just 30 minutes, and to avoid any angry displays by the local townsfolk, the service was only announced after he was buried. Randall was buried next to his mother while his dog, Bo, scratched into the dirt during the graveside ceremony. You may be pleased to hear that Bo has since been adopted and given a home with a loving, caring family who feed and walk him regularly. Perhaps the most terrifying thing about Randall Lee Smith is that it seems that there were absolutely no motives to his murders. Scott and Sean could well have been the kindest people Randall had met in his entire life, two people who shared food and warmth with a total stranger, owing him nothing, but giving nonetheless. In return, Randall tried to take everything from them in a sneak attack that changed both men's lives forever. It seems that Randall killed simply for the sake of killing because it thrilled him, because it made him feel powerful. There was no rhyme or reason to his bloodlust, and not even those who were kind and generous to him were safe. Mankind has long fabricated beasts, demons, and malevolent spirits that have only ever been confined to the page or screen. An attempt at creating a kind of uncontrollable fear, a simulation, one intended to distract us and comfort us, because the reality is much more terrifying. Real monsters walk amongst us, looking and sounding just like our friends, neighbors, and family. But they are not driven by love, and they are hungry. Way back when I was in my mid-20s, in the late 1980s, I used to be hardcore into hiking and camping. But given that my home state of Rhode Island is like the size of a postage stamp, relatively speaking anyway, I exhausted a lot of the more local campgrounds pretty quickly and began to long for something a little wilder. I've heard a lot of great things about the Appalachian Trail, how hiking it was a badge of honor for a lot of people who shared my passion for the outdoors. My uncle on my dad's side had hiked the whole thing over the course of a summer back in the 50s, and he never shut up about it whenever he'd see me and the subject of hiking came up. He made it sound absolutely magical, like there was true wilderness out there just waiting to be explored. And so, I made up my mind to mimic the journey my uncle took over one summer. I couldn't get the time off of work to walk the whole trail, but if I timed it right, I could walk the southern portion of the trail from Harper's Ferry to Asheville, North Carolina in just a couple of weeks, fulfilling a hiking dream I've had for what seemed like an age. Then, in the summer of 1989, I traveled down to Harper's Ferry by bus and by train with all my hiking and camping gear on my back. After picking up a few final supplies from my journey south, I hiked up onto the Appalachian Trail and kicked off the journey of a lifetime. Needless to say, the first few days' walk were pretty tough, but I got used to the level of strain pretty quickly, and I'm telling you, I've never been as hungry or tired as I was on those first few nights up in Appalachia. I brought a hammock with me, as I'd heard some pretty intense stories about the bugs down in West Virginia. Nasty little beasties with names like the assassin bug, which basically has a big spike for a mouth, or cow-killer ants whose stings are so painful that they're said to have taken down an actual cow once or twice. That had to be pure rumor, but it was intimidating nonetheless. So, every night after my day's hike, I'd take it out of my pack, unroll it, and tie it up between two trees before getting some shut-eye. It didn't make for the comfiest night's sleep I'd ever had, but I wasn't complaining, especially if it kept the black widows off me. But since I was out in the woods, most nights without cover, every little hoot or squawk from nocturnal animals would wake me up. It was irritating, sure, but it was part and parcel with being out there bonding with nature. So this one night, I wake up pretty sure that I'd heard something rustling in the leaves close by. I shift in my hammock, peering over my shoulder, and then feel my blood run cold as I see this big, dark shape looming over me. I froze for a moment, feeling my eyes adjust to the darkness, and I could tell that it was a person, just standing there, statue still, staring at me. In one fluid motion, I rolled out of my hammock and hit the ground running, bolting off into the trees. I didn't care who it was standing over me. Whoever does that kind of thing definitely did not have the best intentions, and I wasn't about to stick around to make small talk either. I ran a safe distance into the woods, caught my breath, circled around, and then started to sneak back towards my camp. My intention was to make sure it was clear before gathering up my stuff and moving on to a safer spot. I took it slowly, scanning the darkness for any sign of the shadowy figure, eventually finding my way back to my camp to discover it was completely deserted, with all my gear apparently untouched. I had this horrible feeling in my gut that whoever had been standing over me had just backed off to watch from a distance and would wait for me to come back and get my stuff before ambushing me. If they weren't there to steal from me, it was obviously something else they wanted, and I dreaded to think exactly what that was. But regardless, I managed to grab my stuff and get out of the area without anyone managing to sneak up on me. The next few days, I walked hard and fast, exhausting myself in my attempt to get as far away from the area as possible. After that, I figured I was safe. No one had bothered me during the previous few days hiking, so I figured I'd be okay from there on out. But I was wrong, hideously wrong. Every single night since that incident had me struggling to get to sleep. I kept picturing that person standing over me, just staring down at me in the darkness. I had no idea how long they'd been there or what they had in mind for me, and I was just glad that I'd gotten out of the area. But still, I didn't start to be able to feel safe again until I bought some fishing line from a sporting goods store in one of the small towns I'd passed through on my way down the trail, which I could then use to make tripwires that ran between the trees close to where I was camping. Then a couple of empty cans of beans strung together, and whoever snagged their foot on the wire would make the cans clank together, alerting me to their presence. I had one big scare when a fox snagged the line, and I rolled out of my hammock with a knife in hand, ready to take on whoever was about to creep up on me, only to see the furry little guy scurrying away into the moonlight. I did end up laughing to myself about that one, and after that, I stopped sleeping with my knife in hand because all it would have taken was one little slip and I'd be in a whole world of trouble. About a week went by, and I'd just about gotten over the whole shadowy figure in the night incident. I had to be almost 100 miles away from where it had taken place, and I'd had no trouble at all on any of the other nights, save the incident with the fantastic Mr. Fox that had just scared the life out of me. So, with the help of my little tripwire alert device, I just started being able to get to sleep without any trouble again. But that night, I woke up suddenly to find that I couldn't move properly. I couldn't bring up my arms up from my sides at all, and the material from the hammock seemed to be pushed up right into my face. I was cocooned by it, like the fabric was wrapped around my entire body. This is only just registered in my half-awake brain when I heard the sound of fabric snapping. Then boom, I hit the dirt, completely knocking the wind out of me. I had no idea what was going on, struggling to break out of the hammock, only I couldn't. That's when I felt the hammock being dragged across the forest floor. Then it hit me. Whoever was dragging me across the ground had bundled me up in my own hammock with some kind of cord, cut the ropes tying me to the tree, and was proceeding to drag me off to God knows where. I screamed at the very top of my lungs for whoever it was to let me out of there, but no one responded.
All I could hear was the sound of the hammock's fabric rustling against the forest floor. I knew I had to think fast, or whatever was going on wouldn't end well at all. Like I said, I had stopped sleeping with my knife in my hand or nearby me in my hammock because that was just an accident waiting to happen, so I had absolutely nothing handy to cut through the material and make my escape. Or so I thought. In a flash, I had an idea. A few years back, my dad had gifted his old wristwatch to me. It was a reliable old thing, but I had just one complaint about it. The little latch that kept it tied to my wrist was worn with age and was actually a little sharp from the years of use. I'd managed to accidentally poke myself a few times with it in the process of picking it up or putting it on, and one time it actually drew blood. I knew what I had to do. I unbuckled the watch as quickly as I could, which wasn't easy considering I was getting dragged along the ground in the pitch darkness, and managing to pinch the sharp clasp between my thumb and index finger was even harder, but still I managed it. And when I did, I began to rake it against the fabric of the hammock. It was just as effective as cutting canvas as it was at cutting skin, and although it took a good few tries, it didn't take long until I could see the subtle glow of the silvery moonlight from the other side. I kept cutting, as quickly and quietly as I could, until there were so many cuts that I could rip myself out of the canvas cocoon like some terrified newborn bursting out of a womb. You'll have to excuse the analogy, but in retrospect, that's exactly what it seems like happened. I was born again that night. I got a second chance at living. Escaping that hammock meant life because I know that staying in it would have meant death. For the second time in about 10 days, I found myself bounding through the dark woods, only that second time, the terror in me dwarfed what I had felt the first time around. I don't even know how I managed to escape. Assuming it was the same figure standing over me the first night, they had somehow managed to track me for more than 100 miles and sneak past my tripwires. They were a far better woodsman than me, probably physically fitter too. I just know by the time I reached the house with its lights on, I turned to look behind me as I was banging on the door. There was no one else around. The family who lived there were kind enough to put me up for the night after I called the local sheriff, who came out in the morning to help me retrace my steps through the woods. We found my camp, but not the hammock. And although I told him everything in excruciating detail, I could tell he was skeptical of my story. He even suggested that I'd gotten lost and frightened in the dark and had just ended up jumping at shadows, maybe even had a bad dream that seemed a little too vivid because of the lack of proper rest, but I knew it was real. Just in the way my palms are sweating writing this back, I'm certain that night really did happen the way I remember it. I never did finish that dream hike. The next day I caught a bus back towards Harper's Ferry, then took the train all the way back to Providence, and I only ever told a handful of people who happened out in the trails. I figured not many would really believe me. They'd just think I was telling a campfire tale or something. I didn't tell my hiking uncle for the longest time. I thought that he'd just gloat or whatever, tell me that I didn't have it in me to do something that tough. But when I finally did share my story, I got a reaction that I definitely wasn't expecting. He just nodded and told me that there were some nights that he didn't think that he'd make it out alive either. That there are people who live up in those mountains who have been outlaws for generations, who live outside of society, outside of the natural order of things. He'd have some pretty close calls himself at times, bumping into people who weren't nearly as friendly as the majority of West Virginians, and sometimes seeing things that he knew well he wasn't supposed to see. But just what those things were, he didn't seem to want to say. I always told myself that I'd try my little Appalachian adventure another time, maybe when I'm a little older, a little wiser, and when I've got something a little bigger to defend myself with. The trail will still be there, waiting for me. But then again, so might be whoever tried to drag me off that night. Geraldine Largay kept a detailed record of her journey along the Appalachian Trail during the summer of 2013 in a small black notebook. Due to her pace, she had adopted the trail name Inchworm, but for a slow walker, she had still managed to cover an immense distance, hiking almost 1,000 miles from Harper's Ferry in West Virginia with a close friend of hers named Jane Lee. George Largay, Geraldine's husband of 42 years, was driving ahead of them, arranging care packages and supply pickups for them, occasionally ferrying them to motels for the relief of a hot shower or a night in a soft bed. But on June 30th, as Jane and Geraldine reached New Hampshire, Jane was forced into an early end for an adventure due to a family emergency, but Geraldine insisted on continuing the hike. The trail was almost at an end, and she would not give up so easily. Jane would later say that Geraldine had a poor sense of direction, had taken a wrong turn on the trail more than once, and would become flustered whenever she made such mistakes. Then, while she was all alone, Geraldine ended up taking another wrong turn up in Maine, wandering into terrain so wild that it was used by the state's National Guard for military training. She kept writing after she lost her way. Even as her food supply dwindled along with her hopes of being found, she ended up waiting nearly a month in the Maine woods for help that would never come. Geraldine had left the trail in one of its most rugged sections, with thick underbrush and fir trees packed so tightly that the landscape became a maze of greenery. You step off the trail a little, then turn around, and it's very difficult to see where the path is, reported a volunteer who spends time doing trail maintenance in the area. If you didn't know which way the trail was, you could easily walk in circles for hours. Knowing she was hopelessly lost, Geraldine sought high ground in the hopes of getting a signal on her cell phone. Lost since yesterday, she texted her husband. Off trail 3 or 4 miles. Call police for what to do, please. She tried over and over to send messages, but none went through. In some trouble, another text George read. Got off trail to go to the bathroom, now lost. She asked him to call the Appalachian Mountain Club to see if a trail maintainer could help her, but again, the message was never received. Around July 23rd, she set up her tent atop sticks and pine needles under a canopy of hemlock trees so thick that they obscured her from rescuers searching from the air. She tied a shiny silver blanket between 2 trees, possibly to attract attention, but the foliage was simply too dense for the blanket to be seen from the air. Geraldine was scheduled to meet her husband on July 23rd in Wyman Township, but she never showed. The following day, George reported her missing. Multiple agencies and volunteers would take part in the search for her, using horses and helicopters to traverse the tough terrain. Agonizingly, it would turn out that Geraldine was less than a mile from the trail itself, close enough that, in all likelihood, searchers had probably passed by her campsite without actually realizing it. Infuriatingly, the rescuers were bombarded with a number of false tips regarding the missing woman's whereabouts. Some purported that she had been murdered and strung up in the trees, saying that they'd seen her with sketchy-looking men who might have intended her harm, with others suggesting that she had fallen in a river and drowned. A number of psychics called to report visions of her, including one who incorrectly insisted that she had broken her ankle. Other psychics injected that they were contending that Geraldine had been spotted at a woman's shelter in Tennessee. This actually diverted valuable resources away from the search with accusations that her husband was a batterer, when in reality he had never laid a finger on her for the entirety of their marriage. Her last entry reflected a strikingly graceful acceptance of what was coming. When you find my body, please call my husband George and my daughter Carrie, she wrote. It will be the greatest kindness for them to know that I am dead and where you found me, no matter how many years from now. It would be 2 years before a logging company's surveyor stumbled upon her campsite and remains, solving a mystery that had tormented her family and defied teams of experienced searchers. Miss Largay, a retired nurse from Tennessee, had survived a month on her own, longer than many old backwoods hands thought possible, before dying of exposure and starvation. Her dead body was found on October 14, 2015, still inside her sleeping bag, in a campsite that she had kept tidy until the day she passed away. Around her lay her final belongings, including a blue and white bandana, a rosary, birthday candles, lighters, dental floss, a sewing kit, and 2 water bottles, one still containing water. 2 weeks after she was found, Geraldine's family visited the area in which she tragically lost her life. They left a white wooden cross, decorated with messages etched in black marker, one written in a child's handwriting saying, "I wish you were here." It is quite simply terror-inducing that even in a country as populated and settled as the United States, a person can still go missing on a simple mountain trail and vanish almost without a trace, only to be found months later having starved to death in a country where there is such abundance of sustenance and civilization. Humankind has tamed more and more of America since the nation's founding, but it seems that some particular areas of the country will always be wild. When I was a kid growing up in North Carolina, I was a member of the Boy Scouts of America. I know it might seem corny, but my time in the Boy Scouts honestly made for some of the fondest memories in my childhood. And as much as my friends these days like to make jokes about the deviant proclivities of my former scoutmasters, nothing remotely weird or unsavory ever happened with any of them. There was a lot of fishing, camping, fieldcraft, and community service. Just some good old-fashioned wholesomeness that gave my parents a break from me from time to time. Well, all except for this one time. So one summer, my scout troop goes on this big camping trip up into the Smokies. For those unfamiliar with the term, the Smokies, or Great Smoky Mountains, are a part of the Greater Appalachian Mountains, and are also home to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, one of the most highly visited national parks in the country. The name Smokies comes from the natural fog that often hangs over the mountaintops, appearing as large smoke plumes from a distance and originate from organic compounds that are exhaled by the local vegetation. But excuse the high school science lesson, I'll get on with it. So we're up in the Smokies having a good old time when one night, while sitting around the campfire after dinner, one of our scoutmasters decides to tell us a creepy campfire tale. He starts telling us the story of Utlunta, which is the Cherokee name meaning spear finger, or one with the pointed spear. Spear fingers supposedly live in the western part of North Carolina, right up in the Smoky Mountains where we were camped at the time, and her name referred to the long, slender, sharp finger on her right hand which she used to slice up her child victims, whose livers she ate raw. As legend has it, she apparently clutched the stony skin on her right hand tightly because her heart was actually hidden in her palm there. Our scoutmaster goes on to tell us how, because Spearfinger's skin was made of stone, she was invulnerable to the arrows of the Cherokee, and her footsteps sounded like thunder as she walked along the mountainside. Whenever her deep voice rumbled around the hillsides, it would scare all of the birds away, a warning sign to those she was hunting as she sang her favorite song, Uwe la, Tutsiku, or Liver I Eat. Spearfinger was also said to be able to take on the appearance of her child victims' family members, often taking the form of a kindly old woman to trick her victims into feeling safe around her. She would then lull the child to sleep, running her fingers through their hair to calm them before stabbing her pointed finger through the back of the neck or through the heart. She would then rip out the livers of her victims before feasting on them, leaving her mouth ringed with fresh blood. Needless to say, by the time our scoutmaster had finished telling us the story, we are all completely and utterly terrified, and only managed to stop freaking out once he got out his old guitar and sang us a few songs. But that night, while back in my tent with a buddy of mine, I found myself totally unable to sleep. I kept imagining that if I did, Spearfinger would come, rip my tent open, and stab me in the heart with her long, sharp, stony finger, all before tearing out my liver and eating it. Then, Right as I was about to drift off to sleep, a bright light lit up one side of our tent. I was completely frozen in fear for a moment, whispering for my sleeping buddy to wake up, and I was totally unable to rouse him. I carried on staring at the side of the tent, wondering where the bright light was coming from, as it seemed way too intense to be from someone's torch. And then, I just about let out a whimper of fear when I heard a hissing sound and saw a shadow passing over the fabric of our tent. I called out to them, asking who was there, but no one said a thing in response, and there was just another faint hissing sound as the figure seemed to creep closer and closer to our tent. Then I saw the figure raise a hand and almost choked in terror when I saw a single long pointed finger in a hissing voice whisper, "Wela Siko." I screamed, ripping my way through the front flap of my tent and tearing it around the campsite, screaming, "It's Spearfinger, it's Spearfinger, she's come to eat my liver. Please, God, don't let her eat my liver." I expected the rest of the camp to start screaming too, to burst out of the tents in terror, to maybe just stay inside them in the hopes that Spearfinger might pass over them. And don't get me wrong, there were a couple of other cries of fear that accompanied my own, but the sound that made me slow to a stop and peer around in confusion was the sound of laughter. When I looked, I saw another one of the scouts, this kid named Devin, and he was just about bent over in hysterics with a long, slender twig tied to one finger. I must have been boiling with rage at that point, but Devin just thought that was extra funny, waving the long wooden twig at me and making that same hissing sound again before bursting into laughter. I swear that was probably the most scared and embarrassed I ever was during my entire childhood, and all because that little idiot Devin decided to pull a prank on me. Ever since then, I've never been able to hear the words Smoky Mountains without remembering that Boy Scout camping trip, even if it does make me kind of smile these days. But what doesn't make me smile is seeing liver in the deli section of a grocery store, because all I think about sometimes is the idea of Spearfinger hushing a child to sleep, stroking their hair, singing them a little lullaby with the voice of their grandma or favorite aunt, all before ripping out their liver and feasting on it, with their stony skinned lips ringed with dark, fresh blood. Back in February when this all started, I was working 2 jobs, living with my best friend Lexi and enjoying the high life. Then we got thrown into lockdown, and I swear, Lexi changed immediately. She was so serious about all the virus restrictions that even when I was in the house, I had to wear a mask. I'm not even trying to downplay this by any means, but she was taking it to religious extremes here. Anyway, after one particular argument about washing my clothes 3 times, one for normal wash, one on heavy, and once a 3rd time just to be safe, I had enough and told her I was going to move out. That was dumb move number 1. I was already out of work, waiting and hoping for unemployment, and really didn't have a place to go. My parents are elderly and live 2 states away, so I wasn't going to risk that. Then I got the brilliant idea to post an ad that I needed a room to rent on Craigslist. Yes, that still exists and is still just as sleazy. Lexi forced me to move out that same day, though, calling me all sorts of bad names as she tossed my stuff on her front lawn. I didn't even get a chance to argue. So yeah, desperate times called for desperate measures, and I put an ad on Facebook too with a revealing picture of myself. Call me what you will, but it worked. This older gentleman responded to the ad and contacted me via email. The short message provided me with a small allowance for my gas and instructions on how to get into his apartment when I got there. I didn't ask any questions, although looking back on it, I really should have. You know that saying about too good to be true? Anyway, I grabbed a bite to eat and made it there around 5:30 on foot to save a taxi fee. Place looked nice enough, and I followed his instructions to get buzzed in. He lived on the 6th floor and explained that because of some medical condition, he couldn't meet me in the lobby. Again, stupid me, I didn't ask questions. As he told me in the email, there was a key waiting for me under his doormat. Inside, the place looked nice, well put together. Nothing that made me paranoid or feel the need to run. Then I saw this guy standing in the kitchen wearing, I kid you not, a kabuki mask. At first I laughed because of how bizarre it was. He said his name was Hano and he wanted to keep the mask on because of the quarantine and provided me with one as well with a dragon design on it. He even claimed it was far safer than those other N95 masks, and hey, I was getting a place to sleep, so I figured why not. Next few minutes were him rambling about different things in the apartment, and he showed me to the room. This is where things got a little creepy. I saw that he had some mannequins on display that were wearing traditional Japanese kimono dresses with other kabuki, and they were all lined perfectly on the side of the bed. He insisted I pick one out and get changed. Again, his reasoning was my clothing had the virus on it. Once he excused himself, I sat down on the bed and tried to convince myself that this was normal. So, he was a little eccentric. It's not like he was trying to do something worse than that, right? I went over to one of the mannequins. I think it was wearing a scarlet kimono, and took off the clothing, figuring that I needed to suck it up and appreciate the kindness of strangers. Then the mask it was wearing accidentally fell off, and I noticed that there was a hand-painted face on the other side. It looked very realistic. Once I got finished changing, I went back to the main room where he was now cooking up a fresh meal, and he complimented me on how well the dress fit. I thanked him and casually mentioned the hand painting. "Would you like me to do one for you?" he asked. "But you only saw me when I first came in," I pointed out, gesturing to the mask I was wearing. "It's all right. I've already memorized you," he said. I told him no, and we ate in awkward silence as my eyes glanced around the room. I think the first thing that really made me concerned was when I realized I didn't see an open window in the place, and that the door had a deadbolt on it. "Do you get a lot of break-ins?" I asked him. And again, in a deadpan voice, he said, "More often than not, it's the other way around." Then a few seconds later, he laughed, and I laughed back nervously. He told me that he was going to bed and thanked me for staying with him, but I really didn't feel like I wanted to now. "Hey, I forgot to go grab my phone charger in the car. Where's the spare key?" I remember asking. I was just going for an excuse to get out of there, honestly. This dude had an answer for everything, and this time used my own words against me. "Crime is bad, and it's getting late. You can borrow one of mine and go in the morning." Now, I may not be smart, but I knew that staying probably would mean something bad. I got a sixth sense about it, you know? "I have an iPhone. I think you've got Samsung," I said, hoping that my feeling was wrong and that he wasn't being overly creepy. Again, a dead stare and serious voice. "You're not leaving." He said something in Japanese a second after that and clapped his hands. I don't know why I've never noticed that he had some of those sensor lights, and it got dark in the room a second later. My instinct was to scream, but he placed something over my mouth and I felt immediately faint. But somehow I managed to not black out, and I elbowed him right in the gut. Everything happened so fast after that. I turned around and grabbed what I think was his head and demanded that he tell me where the key was. I felt something smash against my side. I think I kicked him and managed to hit the wall where the light switch was. I flipped it back on and saw that he had fallen over the couch and one of his ornate antiques had smashed. To my thanks, it was also where the spare key was hiding. I grabbed it up and ran to the door as I heard him cuss something in his native tongue again, but I never looked back. When I got downstairs, I told the lobby I needed an Uber stat. I didn't care about money, I just wanted to leave. I saw the elevator moving downward as I raced out the door, and maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, but I heard Hano ask the receptionist where I went. When I got far enough away from his apartment, I texted Lexi and begged her to let me back with her. I promised I would never complain about all her quarantine rules again. I told Lexi the whole thing when she did a little digging, and the icing on top of this creep cake is that The guy apparently had been doing this for some time. Apparently, he would target young women that were either trying to get out of a bad relationship or family situation and promise free rent, but then turned out to be a total creep, watching them night and day when they stayed with him. 2 of the women Lexi said had gone completely missing. It made me think of those weird mannequins, and I wondered if maybe the paintings he did were tributes to victims of a sick mind. I didn't want to think about how he had likely researched about me in the same way, and how easily I could have wound up on that missing persons list. I've been told to share this story online a dozen times and just never had the guts. I think that's probably because no matter how safe I feel, I get the feeling that I'm being watched. This happened back in 2013. I just graduated from high school and got my first job working retail at a local neighborhood Walmart. My manager was a guy named Billy. At the time I was hired, he originally had me running the self-checkouts, but I'll admit I wasn't exactly enjoying the idea of having to be on my feet all day, so I asked if I could work at the money center or the cigarette counter. Money center was only allowed for employees who had been there for 6 months or longer, but he did say there was an opening over for cigarettes and tobacco. For some reason, nobody seemed to want it, and of course, because I was the new fish, they didn't explain to me. It didn't take long before I figured it out, though. There was this underage kid that came in frequently and tried to buy some Marlboro Lights. And of course, I always asked for ID, and that scared him away. Well, at first he did. Then he started showing up later in the day when it was near the end of my shift, and he was becoming a lot more insistent about cigarettes. Finally, I got his name. He claimed that it was Matt. Honestly, I don't have a clue and still don't to this day. First, I tried to be firm but friendly. "Matt, I like you, but this stuff can ruin your health. Matt, I don't think you realize how addictive these things are." Sometimes he would just stop by and chat, and I got the impression that he was starting to flirt. That was when I decided to switch from being nice to laying down the law. "Matt, if I report you to the cops for coming in here and pestering me about smokes, you could get thrown in juvie." I remember warning him. I figured that would end the conversation when he hightailed it out of there. That evening on my way to my car, though, Matt approached me in the parking lot. Honestly, it felt like he had been waiting for me to clock out. I hurried to my car to leave, but he was right there behind me. I reached for my keys where I normally keep a small can of mace, but he moved faster, grabbing my purse and running off across the lot and jumping over a nearby fence. Of course, I reported the whole thing to the police, and they got permission to check the cameras. Somehow, Matt seemed to be aware of where the cameras were positioned because none of the angles showed his face. The cops told me to call again if I got bothered again, and my managers said they would get security to walk me to my car each night. A week passed by without incident, then another. Honestly, I kind of forgot about Matt and figured that he just grabbed my spare cash to go get his fix somewhere else. A month or so later, I was on Facebook when I got a friend request from someone named Leon Carroll. No profile pic, no info besides just generic stuff that looked fake. And then a message. "You're really pretty." I ignored it, then I got 3 similar messages from other dummy accounts. Again, I ignored them all and reported it to Facebook. Been around the block enough times to not respond to those scams. And I didn't put 2 and 2 together until another message came in with a picture of my house. "Stop ignoring me," the message said. Something in my brain clicked that this had to be the kid from Walmart, so I called the cops then and there. Living in a small town, we don't have a cyber unit, so again, I felt like I was wasting my breath. "Sounds like it's just an admirer to me," was what one officer even dared to tell me. When I got off of work that night, I found that my admirer had also decided to vandalize my car. "Stop ignoring me" was sketched out in bold letters on my front door that night. I felt like I just couldn't make a move without this weird kid knowing. Every day on my break, he would send a different anonymous message, usually something really perverted, and expect a response. It was unnerving, but I tried to act like it didn't bother me. Again, a week passed and it seemed like he had given up. It was nearly the holidays by this time, so I decided to go to a nearby Sprint store and get a new phone and make new social media so that Matt would stop bothering me. The next 2 weeks felt like a godsend. I didn't have any more threats or weird texts from dummy accounts. I felt brave enough to even create a dating profile again. I matched with a guy named Richard who asked if I could meet up that night at a local outdoor restaurant. I was feeling confident and didn't see any reason not to. When I got there, I was dressed up, thinking I was going to meet a 20-something guy. Instead, when I got there, I saw who else but this kid sitting there. I think the creepiest thing was how well dressed he was. Not the scruffy little guy I had encountered a few weeks back. Instead, he was dressed to impress, and when he saw me, his eyes sparkled and he ran to meet me. "I was starting to think you wouldn't show," he said. "Matt, what are you doing here?" I asked. He started rambling about how he had misjudged me, started apologizing about all the weird messages and explaining he was having a difficult time talking to girls. "I just want to be normal. Can't we just have that?" But my red flags were brighter than ever. This kid was not stable. He was trying to say all the right things to me, but I didn't want to spend more than even a minute there with him. Somehow I managed to convince him that I was going to freshen up in the bathroom, and when I got there, I dialed 911. They got there about 6 minutes later, and I remember hearing Matt screaming and trying to fight them when they told him that he had to come with them. Later on, I found out that he actually had brought a knife with him because one of the officers said that he had tried to pull it and they tased him. He was sent to juvie, just like I predicted. I later found out that he was staying at the local homeless shelter and apparently kept a whole binder full of photos that he had taken of me. Some of them had weird love notes attached as well. Honestly, I feel sorry for the kid. He started out awkward, and I thought maybe being friendly would have been the answer to make him get on the right course. But after that, I stopped working the cigarettes counter and got a new job at the hardware store across town. Sometimes I forget about him altogether, and then sometimes I still get anonymous messages, and it truly triggers me. My family decided to take a road trip in the summer. Restrictions were lightening up in our state, and we really were sick and tired of being cooped up. So my wife suggested we surprise her folks upstate and drive to see them. We were about an hour into our trip when we ran into some highway construction outside of Galveston and had to take a detour. Traffic was bad, I was angry, the kids were whiny, and I remember pushing my foot down on the pedal and flooring it to go around a couple of cars at one merge to get going. "Daniel," my wife chastised me about it right after it happened. Split-second impulse temper, I guess. Anyways, as we went down the highway, I pointed out that a black Ford pickup truck had decided to cut by and was coming up behind us. "Oh, so if they jump off a bridge, you would too?" she questioned me. I rolled my eyes and just focused on the road while she decided to take a short nap. I guess it was 20 miles later I noticed that the pickup was still behind us, and I thought that was a little strange. There had been enough gaps in highway merges that at least a little distance should have been made, but no, this driver had somehow managed to maintain closeness to us. I kept my eye on them for another 40, some sense of danger softly ringing in the back of my head, I guess. But then I had to pull over and get gas, so I figured that they would just drive on, and they did, and I chalked it up to me being just a little paranoid. As I got out to fill up, I asked my wife and kids if they wanted a snack and went in to grab something. When I came back, I think I felt like I was doing one of those classic double takes from the movies. This black truck was right behind us at the pumps, and not only that, a gentleman had hopped out of his cab and was apparently chatting with my wife. I walked over the snacks and smiled cordially at them, trying to figure out if I was just seeing things, but it was definitely the same truck. "Howdy, name's Mitch. I was just getting friendly with the missus here. Said y'all are headed towards Galveston?" He asked with a strong southern twang. "Yeah, family road trip. You?" "Oh, just about the same." "Nice. I figured that was the case since you've been behind us a while." I was hoping to catch him off guard, but the man just gave a short laugh. "Didn't mean to, but I guess that's what happens. We've been on each other's tails since you decided to cut everyone off at that last interstate turnoff, huh?" "That sounds like an accusation," I blurted out. My wife later chided me for antagonizing the man, and maybe I shouldn't have, but he was definitely giving off some very strange vibes. And this was before things got crazy. He didn't take the bait when I said that. Instead, just tipped his hat and waltzed back to his truck, and I got an earful from Brittany. "I mean, he scared me at first, but I think he's just a little lonely," she offered. "Right. Well, he can go make friends somewhere else," I said as we drove down the highway again. I felt like I couldn't get away from the truck fast enough. About another hour passed by and my wife was checking her social media when I noticed she got this frown on her face. "Something up?" I asked. I had all but forgotten about the strange encounter. It's just kind of weird. Remember that driver we met a while back? He just sent me a friend request on Facebook." Well, delete it," I said bluntly. She chastised me again, but I was serious. Something didn't feel right. I checked to see if he was following us, and Brittany got on to me for being a worrywart. "He's not a serial killer," she teased. But she listened to me and blocked him on Facebook. We were halfway to our destination and decided to stop and get a bite to eat when he showed up again. It was this Waffle House right off the interstate. Honestly, I hadn't seen him about 40 miles, so I was surprised that he had caught up. He just came in, ordered his food, and sat down. Brittany said something about it, and I told her to ignore it. I kept getting this feeling that he was watching us as we ate. Finally, she had gotten tired of my paranoia and walked over to this guy's booth. "My husband wants to know if you're following us," she said. The guy just laughed so loud I think the whole diner heard him. He rattled off some flimsy excuse I didn't buy and then asked if she got his friend request. I was furious and got up and grabbed her hand. "Look, I don't know what your problem is," I said. Then this guy stood up and looked me dead in the eye like he was going to fight me then and there. One of the waitresses told us to take it outside, but I chose to leave before things got serious. When we got on the road again, Brittany realized that she had lost her phone at the diner. "Let me use yours so I can Google where it's at," she told me. Using that Find My iPhone feature, she soon saw that it wasn't at the diner. It was moving down the highway towards us. I knew it had to be the other driver who found it and took it. "Oh my God, is this guy seriously stalking us?" I asked. My wife panicked and tried to call the phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Then she started checking her social media. "Daniel, this is scaring me," she said as she showed me that he had taken multiple pictures of our car as he had followed us for the last several hours. "Call the cops," I told her as I tried to check my mirror and see where he was. About 5 cars behind us. "Okay, there's a rest stop ahead. Tell them that we'll meet them there," I said as she got on the phone with someone. "They're saying it could be another 45 minutes since we're so far out," she said frantically as I pulled over. Right on cue, the other driver did too. "Right. Stay in the car then," I said when he pulled up behind us. Honestly, I was prepared to defend my family then and there, but this guy took it to another level. He pulls out a sawed-off shotgun from his passenger side and aimed it toward me, blasting straight at my tires. I fell to the ground and shouted for my wife to do the same. He did so again on the driver's side and drove off. When the cops came, I did my best to offer a description of him and his vehicle, and they gave us phone numbers for a tow to the next town. We made it there a little after dinner, and honestly, I was so shaken and rattled by the encounter I just wanted to go home. We even added the additional social media profile, hoping that it could help them find the person. And a few days later, they told us that they had found the vehicle. It had been abandoned somewhere, and apparently it was registered as stolen. So we had no clue who this guy was. The worst part about this whole story is that it's not really over. Every so often, my wife will see pictures of our car on social media, and know for a fact it's gotta be the same guy. So this happened when I was in high school and still trying to figure out my orientation. I wasn't straight, I wasn't gay, but it was also the early 90s and I was smart enough to know not to mention anything beyond the norm to my classmates. Most of them accepted that I was just not into dating, but this one chick would not take no for an answer. Let's call her Becky. Becky was on the cheer squad, extremely popular and very bubbly. At least that's how she made sure she appeared to anyone who saw her. I saw the other side of Becky, her darker side where she would taunt me in the cafeteria, calling me belittling names and shame me at any chance she got. Being the queen bee, Becky never got in trouble for what she did. It even got so bad that I told the school counselor, but that didn't help any. You just need to man up, they said. Then they gave me a cheesy brochure about learning how to be a better Christian or some nonsense like that. I threw it in the trash the second I left his office. But that little incident didn't make me furious enough to fight back the next time she tried to pull a prank. It was lunch and she and her friends were making sounds and pretending I was a pig, so I went over and spilled my food all over their table. It felt pretty good doing that, to be honest. And later after 6th period, Becky confronted me in the hallway. "It was pretty gutsy back there, Steve," she said. I thought she was going to pull another prank or maybe even try to start a fight since I had nowhere to run. Instead, to my surprise, she leaned in and kissed me right on the lips. I remember being confused and shocked. And then she started chatting about how she found it hot, that I played hard to get and wanted to know if maybe I wanted to go on a date. That was a complete 180 behavior from before, so I was suspicious. Besides which, I really wasn't interested. I cautiously told her I would think about it and she gave me her phone number, but I still felt it had to be a prank. She refused to leave until I gave her my home phone number too, though, and including my online screen name. And that evening back home, I started getting messages. She was sending messages that were provocative and it made me uncomfortable. I told her to stop and she even sent a picture. My brother's in the room with me, and surprised when he saw that and even started whistling. "Wait until Mom sees this. She's gonna hear about it," he teased. "It's not like that. This girl is taunting me. You know, I'm not into girls like that." "Well, send her my way. She's hot," he said. I remember rolling my eyes and shooting messages back to Becky, thinking it would possibly end this whole charade if she found out that I told my family. To my surprise, she agreed to start chatting with my brother. Things kinda escalated quickly after that. Becky became my brother's girlfriend in less than a week and was over to our house 2 or 3 times during the week for study sessions. My parents weren't the brightest bunch, but insisted that I chaperone them. Often that still led to them making out with each other, and every time they did, I got this really creepy sensation that Becky was putting on a show, like she was just pretending to like my brother to make me jealous. Sometimes I saw her look at me as she would grind on him. I would tell them to stop and they would both giggle and tell me I didn't like it, I could just leave the room. I warned them I would tell Mom and Dad, which of course infuriated my brother, and he shoved me out after that. I held true to that though and ratted them out. Becky could only come over once a week after that. At school, she kept up the acting. She was interested in me though, sending me dirty messages over instant messenger telling me to not show anyone, especially not my brother. She also warned me if I did say something, she was going to tell the whole school that I was coming out as trans. No, this was the Deep South, by the way, and at that time, coming out like that would be a death sentence, and I felt trapped. I couldn't tell my brother, my parents, and the school wouldn't listen, and Becky just kept making things worse. This went on for about 2 months. She would try to make out with me every day at school, and I would manage to get away or hide in the restroom till next period. And then when she came to see my brother, she would flaunt herself at me. I tried to tell my brother that she was obviously obsessed with me, but he said I was imagining things. Things came to a head at around Halloween. There was a dance that the whole school was attending, and my parents were also going to be out of town. I got sick before the dance and stayed home, and my brother went to go pick Becky up while I laid down. Now, the next part I can only say happened per what my brother told me, but apparently Becky started acting weird at the dance and said that she felt sick. Then she slipped away to the restroom. Well, he got impatient and went to find her and discovered that she had left the school entirely. He told me he drove back home, not thinking much of it. Maybe she was really sick. Then when he got home, he saw that our front door was wide open. He woke me up after that and told me that we had a break-in. We called her mother and father, and they told us to check their home security system. I remember my brother was pacing the room as he was on the telephone with her mom and dad, and his face went white as a sheet. "What is it?" I asked. "It was Becky," he explained. I didn't understand at first why she would break in, but he explained that according to mom and dad, she had brought a camera and came up to my room where I was sleeping and just took pictures of me, like for about 20 minutes until my brother got home. After that, my brother broke up with her, and my parents refused to let either one of us have anyone over to the house for like 6 months, and we filed a restraining order against Becky and even used the security footage as evidence. She left me alone, thankfully, but she sometimes would smile and wink every blue moon. To this day, I have no idea what she did with those pictures, and the cops said unless she posted them somewhere or potentially did something worse, she really didn't break any sort of privacy laws. A year later, she moved away, but I still think about all the grief she gave me and wonder why she was so obsessed. I don't think I really want to know the answer, though. All those posts on my Facebook feed about New Year's resolutions have had me thinking about an experience I had a few years back that I still have a hard time dealing with emotionally. Anytime I think about it, I actually feel like my stomach gets in knots and I need to vomit. It was that bad. This isn't actually my first experience with a stalker, but it's the one that comes fresh to my mind this time of year. It was February and I had just gotten my tax refund, so my best friend convinced me to join her local Legends gym. I told myself this was the year I was going to make a change and get healthy. I think everyone says that. Anyway, what I really liked about this gym was that they would give all members a passcode and you could come at weird hours to work out. Since I usually have to work a split shift as a CNA, having the chance to swing by the gym super early when I clocked out was a blessing. Usually I'll get off around 2 in the morning, so of course there weren't very many people using the equipment. It was like a literal ghost town. A little creepy though, especially since they had obnoxious 80s music constantly on repeat throughout the entire building. I settled into routine with that gym, first a short shower and then heading over to the ladies only section. That was another thing I thought was nice about the place. Fellas, don't get me wrong, but I am a bit self-conscious and I prefer to do my workouts in private. In that separate part of the building, I was usually the only one there, It was even quieter back there because the music was muffled, and I'll admit that there were a few times that I thought it was a bit eerie. Sometimes you hear something and at that time of the morning it gives you the jitters, you know? Somehow I convinced myself to stick to the routine even when my bestie dropped off the wagon in March. I was determined, and honestly the membership fee was one of those locked-in contracts, so you know what a hassle it is to get out of that. And despite the emptiness of the gym, I convinced myself that it was okay. Since no one was there, I couldn't possibly be bothered, right? Well, a few weeks passed, and I was getting on one of the exercise bikes when I noticed something strange attached to the monitor. I paused in my workout and took it off, trying to figure out what it was supposed to be. It was smaller than my finger. Then I noticed a reflective surface, and I realized that it was some kind of camera. I stopped working out immediately and went home, a little freaked out. I told my bestie about it the next day, asking if she had ever seen anything like that while she was at the gym. "Oh yeah, girl, they do that all the time. It's in the contract you sign," she said nonchalantly. I tried again to explain to her why it bothered me. She has never really understood my experience previously with stalkers, but that is another story. If some guy's giving me that much attention, I would jump on him then and there. "If it really bothers you, though," she said, "just talk to Mike, the general manager, and I'm sure he can calm you down." I did that the next day, leaving for work early so I could meet this Mike guy beforehand. He was a lanky man in his mid-20s and seemed nice enough, and when I told him about the camera, he did actually show genuine concern. "Huh, that is weird. And you found it over where?" I guided him over to the bike and showed him where it was attached. It's definitely not one of ours," he told me. He promised that he would look into it and figure out if someone was tampering with the machines, but just the confirmation that it was apparently a hidden camera made me feel extremely on edge. I stopped going to that gym after that, and my mind constantly was conjuring up crazy scenarios about maybe one of my exes having found out that I worked there. I've managed to break away from 2 obsessive ex-boyfriends before, and it literally made me panic to think that one of them might be back in my life. I was trying to get my life right, and I didn't need this drama at all. I think a day or 2 passed and Mike contacted me. "Hey, I think we figured out who was messing with the equipment, but there's a problem," he said. And that didn't sound good. I remember my heart dropped when I asked why. "Well, on camera I can see them coming into the gym when another member enters. They go work out casually for a few hours until the building is kind of empty, and then I spotted them slip the camera on the machine and leave. But when they leave and enter, they don't scan a membership card. I'm pretty sure whoever this is, they actually aren't supposed to be here." That made me even more freaked out. I asked if I could come by the next day to check the cameras and see if I recognized the person. I was completely convinced that it had to be one of my exes. When I got there the next day, I even insisted that my bestie come with me. I felt that paranoid going into that gym again. We watched the security tape together with Mike, and I kept waiting for him to identify who the guy was. But much to my surprise, he told me it was a girl. Some tall, blonde, fit chick that came in odd hours, always waiting until a member entered or left. I didn't recognize her at all. I checked the times. It's probably just a coincidence that they chose that machine. They weren't targeting you. Anyways, we put up a warning to anyone else. We don't want any pervs in this facility, obviously," Mike told me. I did feel a sense of relief after that, and Mike did post a grainy picture of the perpetrator near the front desk, so I actually convinced myself to start working out again. It didn't take but 2 days before I saw this blonde at the gym, though, and I swear seeing her in the flesh made my blood run cold. Like Mike said that she waited until someone came into the building and slipped in. Then she would go work out in the ladies' room. When I was there, it was just me and her. And I got this really weird feeling that she was just watching me. I mean, was it her? And was I the one being targeted by her? It was just really confusing. I thought maybe I should confront her, figuring out if it was her and what she wanted, but she left before I mustered up enough courage. When I left, though, I found out that someone had taken my clothes from my locker, and I panicked again. I knew it had to be the mystery stalker. I canceled my gym membership after that. Despite the fees, I told myself it wasn't worth dealing with this crazy woman or any legal process that I would have had to gone through with him. My friend rejoined a few months later, and get this, the blonde girl apparently had even gotten a job there. My bestie always said that the blonde would ask about me if I was coming back to the gym. Dear God, I don't plan to. I bought a stationary bike and started working out at home. I think she quit a little after that when she realized that I wasn't coming back, and it was so hard to pin it on her. I still wonder what she was doing, why she was constantly filming me, and whether I should still be on edge. When I was in college, I met this guy that became absolutely obsessed with me. Didn't matter that I was dating someone else. Didn't matter that I told him to leave me alone. It got so bad that I actually had to fail some of my classes and leave campus. He was getting his associate's degree in cosmetology, and we met after class one spring morning. I was friendly to him, introduced him to my boyfriend at the time, Craig, and we went our separate ways. I remember telling him I thought it was neat that he was going to become a hairstylist. Not many guys I knew got into the field. He was a little awkward and shy, clearly still didn't know how to talk to girls, but he thanked me and said he hoped to see me in class soon. That night he sent me a friend request on Facebook, and honestly I didn't see the harm in responding. His profile said that he was from the same neighborhood as me growing up, and I decided to be friendly and ask about his family. He responded almost right away, teasing that I had stalked his profile and said that he grew up almost a block from where my parents lived. Yeah, it's crazy we never met before, I told him. He admitted that he didn't know me or remember ever seeing me, but he did say that he thought my name sounded familiar. Nothing about the conversation would have led me to think that he was going to go completely bonkers in less than 24 hours. I told him that I hoped to get to know him better in class and logged out. I always turn my phone off at night so I can get a good night's sleep. Even my folks know that. If it's an emergency, I can't help anyway, I always say. The next day, this dude has sent me at least 300 messages, probably more. My phone blew up with all these notifications, and it took me a minute to figure out what was happening. I read them through as fast as I could, and honestly I don't remember much about it except that he went off the rails very quickly. First apologizing about not knowing me, then making up some experience where he thought maybe he did know me. Then he was rambling about his life, his problems, and how no one understood him. I was beginning to feel he was mentally unstable, if the plethora of messages wasn't already evidence enough. Late in the wave of texts, he was becoming angry that I wasn't responding. He was so mad that he started threatening me, my boyfriend, and even my parents. Rambling about how he knew that I was a pathetic excuse for a daughter, that I would never amount to anything, and that I should just give up and die. It freaked me out so bad, so I just deleted and blocked him immediately. I told Craig about it, and he told me not to get too worried. I'll stay with you when you go from class to class. We have the same schedule, so if this weirdo does try something crazy, I'll be right there, he told me. That sounded good and all, but the next day, Craig had to go see about his car. He was never good at keeping his words, so when I went to class, this dude followed me the whole way. He kept his distance and didn't say anything, but I knew he was following me. He sat behind me in the seminars we attended too. I mentioned to the teacher, not wanting to cause any problems, just that I was freaked out. The teacher actually had the audacity to call him out right there in class in front of everyone and tell him to say that he would stop bothering. I felt humiliated and frustrated because I knew this guy was borderline sociopathic from the texts I had gotten. And immediately after class, he confronted me, asking why I ratted him out. Thought we were friends, he told me. I tried to make him leave me alone, told him that his messages scared me a little, and he just became more irritated. He even tried to follow me into the ladies' restroom. I remember he was cursing and getting angry, banging on the door and telling me he just wanted to talk. I got on my phone and called security. The college made a big fuss about it because when the officer did come, this dude lied his way out of stalking me, claiming that I had stolen something from him. He had pictures of this necklace that he said he had given to me as a gift, said that we were dating and I decided to break it off and flush the necklace down the toilet. I tried to tell college security that was all a lie, but this guy was really convincing, so they punished me instead. I had to miss 2 days of class due to a disciplinary suspension. That actually went on for a few months. Craig would always have something to do the days that this guy would follow me around campus, and he knew how to lie his way out of any situation. It was unnerving because no matter where I went, he was there too. He was smart enough to not ever bother me when anyone else was around, but when I was alone, he would always try to get close to me. One time he grabbed me and pinned me to a wall. I think he expected I was going to scream or something because he smiled and said he liked when I played hard to get. Only thanks to 2 girls walking by did he let me go. I usually would have to go hide in the bathroom until it was time for my next course, and even then he was just standing there waiting outside. Eventually it got really bad because he had convinced a lot of people at the campus that we were sleeping with each other. Like I said, this guy was cunning. He was a good student, never got in trouble, and he was very convincing. Even Craig almost believed that story because somehow the guy was photoshopping me into pictures with him on Instagram. It was almost the end of semester by this point, and I had enough, so I found an excuse to use some sick time and stay at home until time for finals. But this guy actually came to my dorm and tried to get in. And this was the last straw for me because even after I managed to prove to officers that he was the culprit, he managed to smooth talk his way out of trouble again. Craig was the one who suggested I should drop out and finish fall classes, so that's what I did. I changed my number and moved back in with my parents. I think sometimes after that night, this guy would try to sneak over and see if my window was open because I caught a figure on the streets a few times late at night. But eventually, after my dad bought a home security system, he stopped. It still rattles me to this day to think that I was this close to getting really, really hurt. My mom owned a truck diner, and when I was little, I helped out by waiting tables. All the drivers that would come through would always call me a little lady, and it made me feel like I was being responsible, and Mom seemed to appreciate it. There was this one driver, though, that really bothered me. I was only 10 or 11 at the time, but even at that age, this guy gave me a predator vibe. My mom had always taught me to be careful with strangers and not overly friendly, and I think I usually followed that advice. But thinking about this driver, I'm honestly not sure I was too friendly, or what exactly made him decide to be obsessed with me. Anytime he came in, he would always get really chatty with my mom and with me, asking about our life, my pets, my favorite toys, anything really. I thought at first he was just really a big talker, lonely. A lot of truckers were, even at that age, and I knew it had to be hard constantly traveling. When he left though, Mom warned me that I shouldn't talk to him much if he ever came back in. Something about him was off, and even she could sense that. He did come by often to our diner, at least 2 or 3 times a month. I remember he said that he worked long hauls in the area, and this was the only place that served good pumpkin pie. "Your mama's an amazing cook. Shame your daddy left her, huh?" he told me one day. I don't really know if I responded, but I distinctly remember him asking, "Don't you sometimes wish you had a new daddy?" It freaked me out, and I went to hide in the kitchen until he left. I didn't tell Mom. Honestly don't know why. She did ask me, but I just said I was sick. Next time he came in, Mom actually had to take care of business, and I was alone for like maybe an hour. I really was actually surprised when I saw him, but I couldn't just ignore a customer. So I offered him a tray, and I remember that he apologized for before. I blamed myself for second-guessing because I accepted it, and then he asked me where my mom was. Without thinking, I told him she wasn't there. "She left you here alone?" he asked in surprise. You know how sometimes people say things and they sound like pleasant about them? That's how this guy sounded. He was happy to hear my mom wasn't there. He asked when she was coming back. I told him I didn't know. And then he said something out of the blue. "Do you like dogs?" I was 10. Of course I did. "I have a puppy on my truck. Want to go see?" I thank my lucky stars my mom taught me not to be so gullible. I was uneased by the offer and told him that I couldn't leave the diner unattended, especially since Mom wasn't there. I even suggested he could show me the dog next time. "Oh, it's for my little girl. She's about your age. Next time I come through, she won't be with me. Come on, it'll only take a second." I regret that I didn't say no. I think honestly I was scared he would do something if I did say no. He insisted that his truck was right outside and I followed, but I really did feel scared out of my mind. I saw his big truck and stopped about 10 feet away. "You gotta get up in the cab," he told me, and I shook my head no. Come on. I have a toy in there too. You said you liked Barbies, right?" I was surprised that he remembered, and then he really surprised me when I saw he wasn't lying. He reached in his truck and took out this brand new in-the-box Barbie doll, and I saw the dog too. It was a small boxer, wagging its tail. For a split second, I let my guard down and took a few more steps toward him. Somehow, before I reached his truck, my mom appeared out of nowhere. I don't know if she had telepathy or what, but she chewed the driver out and dragged me back inside. "What were you thinking?" she screamed at me later. After that incident, she refused to let him inside the diner. Honestly, I think that made things worse. He would start sending gifts to the diner, addressed to me. And I don't mean ordinary things. I'm talking about like clothes, fancy dresses. My mom was at her wit's end for about a month. When the stuff came in, she would toss it in the trash. She tried to call her sister to come watch me during the day, but the diner was pretty off the road and my aunt always claimed she was too busy. "Put her back in public school," Tammy said. But Mom said the schools were too far away and she liked me close, especially now that I had a stalker. I think someone later contacted a state trooper about the trucker, gave the officer a description and let them take all of the gifts that she had chosen not to throw away. Maybe get some fingerprints or something, I don't know. I don't really know if they ever found anything because about 2 months after that, Mom decided to move out of town. I asked her about it a few years back. Some memory had clicked it back into my brain and she got very quiet. "That man was going to take you. I think he probably would have killed you had I not been there that day," she said with a shudder. She told me that the cops had never found out who it was, despite all the things that he had sent me. And creepiest of all, she told me that he had sent me love letters. She had held on to one of them, thinking maybe one day she would contact the FBI or something, but after we moved, I guess the stalker had decided to move on. The letter said that he wanted to raise me, that I was a beautiful girl and I deserved a good father. It sounded sweet on the surface. Typed out, of course, so no way to trace it, really. I'm convinced after reading the letter that this guy was going to kidnap me and probably a lot worse. Considering its origins are rooted in a hot or not ripoff that was dreamed up in a Harvard University dorm room, it's all the more astounding that Facebook has become one of the most powerful information and communication tools in the history of mankind. Millions upon millions of people around the world use Facebook to keep in touch with one another. They use it to organize social events, wish each other happy birthday, and have pointless arguments about everything from politics to whether or not pineapple belongs on pizza. Yet there are those that use Facebook for considerably more nefarious purposes. Not simply park runs or bake sales, and such uses have raised some serious questions over the past few years that have actually ended up with the head of the company being questioned in front of the United States Senate. What follows is just one of many cases in which Facebook has been used in direct contravention of its founding purpose, to break down the social networks that make up our society instead of enriching them. 32-year-old Stephen Carrillo first met 30-year-old Robert Justice in the flesh when he picked him up from the San Leandro train station in California on May 29th of last year. It was their first meeting, yet the two were already very familiar with one another, having talked back and forth online for quite a while. They had met in a Facebook group that catered towards those that identified as being members of the so-called Boogaloo movement, a group of anti-government meme lords who loathe the federal government. Some members of this movement toy with the idea of starting a second American Civil War. Others seem deeply committed to doing so. Using Facebook as a means of communication and organization, Stephen and Robert formulated a sinister plan to drive out to a BLM protest in Oakland, where they would seek to launch an attack on federal law enforcement officers using the unrest as cover for their actions. And in a swift and brutal strike, a federal security guard named Dave Underwood would be shot dead, with another of his colleagues being severely injured in an incident that marked a summer of violence across the entire United States. The murder was planned to coincide with massive national protests against the death of George Floyd, the African-American man whose tragic death whilst in the custody of Minnesota police caused worldwide outrage. Stephen Carrillo and Robert Justice saw the protests as a perfect cover for their sinister plot. Protests they could use to camouflage their own twisted agenda, which sought to further split an already divided country. A short while after some of the more violent protests erupted, Carrillo took to the Boogaloo Facebook group he was a member of to post, "Go to the riots and support our own cause." Their cause being the desire to spark a second civil conflict. Use their anger to fuel our fire. Think outside the box. We have mobs of angry people to use to our advantage. Over the past 6 years or so, Facebook has increasingly become the place where extremist fringe groups of all creeds come together and plan events, be they demonstrations or outright violent attacks. It's one of the handful of platforms on which anti-government, pro-gun protesters coordinated demonstrations over quarantines. It's also a platform on which leftist and anarchist groups organize themselves, for example during the establishment of the so-called Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. But more pertinent to this case, it's where the many discordant Boogaloo groups sought to organize their own fractured movements into something more refined and efficient. What's become known as the Boogaloo movement is a loosely knit coalition of groups comprising left-wingers, right-wingers, and anarchists. But the one thing they all have in common is that they're strongly opposed to law enforcement and either centralized government control or capitalism. Bizarrely enough, the name seems to originate from the 1984 cult breakdancing movie Breakin' 2: Electric Boogaloo, but has evolved to become a jokey reference to either violent activity in general or, in some specific cases, what many see as the inevitable Second American Civil War. While some groups have remained focused purely on anti-federal government talking points and activities, others verge on anarchism, white supremacism, or even actual neo-Nazism. When I say Nazism, I'm not talking about anything right of center, which some more cynical members of the left wing might call Nazism. I'm talking about legitimate, dyed-in-the-wool, Hitler-idolizing National Socialists who don't bother using cryptic references but straight-up Führer worship. And over the past few months, several self-identifying Boogaloo members have put their ideologies into action, resulting in their arrests for actual felonies such as building pipe bombs or conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism. Terrifyingly enough, Facebook alone is apparently now home to at least 125 of those so-called Boogaloo groups, totaling around 73,000 members. Research has shown that more than half of the groups were formed between February and April, a time frame that matches the implementation of certain lockdowns. The Institute for Strategic Dialogue, a global research organization that focuses on political extremism, agrees that the growth of Boogaloo Group's online activity is intrinsically linked to the pandemic. During the months in which lockdowns were imposed on citizens and private businesses, the Institute's report that more than 200,000 posts across social media included the term Boogaloo, a sharp rise of 52% on Twitter and 22% on Reddit. Brian Levin, the director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at a major California university, was quoted as saying, "Social media sites like Facebook serve as a virtual meeting hall for people who not only like to chat, but for extremists, and there's this whole ecosystem right out in the open." Despite Facebook allowing these Boogaloo groups to be active on its platform, the company has recently pledged that it would stop recommending them to users through its sidebar algorithm. Facebook also promised to remove any content that shared statements or images that depict, glorify, or promote any kind of armed violence. On top of that, the company said that anyone self-identifying as a Boogaloo enthusiast who has also attempted to commit mass violence will have their account pulled under its Dangerous Individuals policy, a system that originally came out due to Islamic State violence in Iraq and Syria. It was only recently that Facebook revealed that it has a team of around 300 experts with backgrounds in law enforcement, counterterrorism, or radicalization who are dedicated to studying violent or extremist behavior on the site. It is the job of this team to analyze new trends in speech, as well as how various groups use Facebook's socialization capacity to evolve over time. However, given that Facebook has over 2.5 billion users active every single month, a lot of extremist or violent activity can pass these experts by without being detected, and this is exactly what happened with Stephen Carrillo and Robert Justice's scheme to mount an attack on law enforcement officers in Oakland. Facebook released a statement in the aftermath of the two men putting their plan into action, saying that they simply did not have the manpower to be able to pick up on every single one of its users' messages or planned events. However, once news had spread that the attack had been planned on their platform, Facebook pulled the two men's accounts, citing the aforementioned Dangerous Individuals policy. A spokesperson for Facebook released a statement saying that, "We designated these attacks as violating our policies and removed the accounts for the two perpetrators along with several other groups. We will remove content that supports these attacks and continue to work with law enforcement in their investigation." But to many media commentators, this was simply not a robust enough response. Several publications gave Facebook, its CEO, and its chief operating officer a serious dressing down, claiming that Mark Zuckerberg and his colleagues were only interested in protecting their vast incomes and were not remotely interested in the safety or security of the general public. But who exactly were these two Boogaloo boys that took their views to such extremes? Very little is known about Robert Justice right now, but we can confirm that Stephen Carrillo was an active duty sergeant in the United States Air Force when he met Robert at the train station in his white Ford van. When Robert climbed in, Stephen apparently offered him a pistol and some body armor. Despite having planned for violence, Robert Justice apparently declined his friend's offer, so Stephen told him to drive the van instead, while he would take up position as the shooter. Earlier that day, Stephen had quickly laid out his plan in the Boogaloo Facebook group the pair were members of. We know this because the Federal Bureau of Investigation managed to obtain those conversations from Facebook once they were presented with a search warrant. Stephen had apparently written that it's a great opportunity to target the specialty soup boys, using a bizarre term that supposedly refers to federal law enforcement agents. Stephen also added 2 fire emojis to his message, then shared a YouTube video showing a large crowd viciously attacking California Highway Patrol vehicles. Robert Justice then simply replied with, "Let's boogie." The two men then drove to downtown Oakland, where the George Floyd protests were growing in intensity and size. At around 9:30 that evening, Robert parked up his friend's van in front of a federal courthouse that was just 3 blocks from the protest itself. Then, after a brief discussion that lasted around 15 minutes, he started up the engine again and drove up to an occupied guard post outside the courthouse. Stephen Carrillo then slid open the rear passenger side door and unleashed several gunshots at the 2 unsuspecting security guards that were manning the guard post, hitting them both several times. In the aftermath of the attack, the FBI worked at reconstructing the incident using footage taken from surrounding surveillance cameras and by tracking both men's phone records. But neither were arrested that night, and both men managed to get away, with Robert Justice heading back home and not seeing Stephen Carrillo again. Just a matter of hours after the shooting, the slain security guard's name began to trend on numerous social media apps, with a very vocal minority of people blaming the BLM protesters for his killing. The then U.S. President Donald Trump even mentioned it during a speech on June 1st, stating that these are not tactics of peaceful protest, these are acts of domestic terror. Carrillo's plan had worked almost perfectly. He had totally disguised the murder as the work of another organization entirely, but for him, the shooting was to be just the beginning of a grand operation that he'd hoped would spark off another civil war. Merely 8 days later, on June 6th, he is believed to have shot dead Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Deputy Damon Gutzwiller before wounding another police officer. As the FBI pieced together the evidence of Carrillo's crimes, agents said they recovered a number of items linking him to the Boogaloo movement. In his white van, federal agents claimed to have found a bulletproof vest with an igloo patch attached, along with a Hawaiian t-shirt, which are apparently both popular symbols with those who consider themselves as Boogaloo boys. And after the attack on the security guards, Carrillo is said to have used his own blood to write Boogaloo-inspired phrases on the hood of a car, including the word boog in the phrase "Stop the duopoly," which apparently refers to America's two-party political system. Since his arrest by FBI agents, Stephen Carrillo has been charged with both murder and attempted murder, and if he's found guilty, could face the death penalty. Robert Justice has been charged with aiding and abetting murder and attempted murder. Carrillo's lawyer said that beyond the federal complaint, he hasn't actually seen any independent evidence whatsoever linking either man to the Boogaloo movement. He also said that advocating violence is obviously extremely immoral, but that everything remains just an accusation until solid evidence is presented. We're looking into what extent the supposed Boogaloo movement may have influenced Mr. Carrillo, his defense attorney said. He's certainly reported to express a great love for this country and a great love for what this country stands for. But if we can seriously link Carrillo to a movement that wishes to cause a massive civil conflict, can he seriously be described as having a great love for the United States? Who in their right mind loves their country, but would want to see so much of its people and property killed or destroyed? When pressed for a statement, a spokesperson for Travis Air Force Base, the California air base where Carrillo was serving, told reporters that its members were cooperating with police in their investigation, and that their thoughts and prayers were with anyone affected by the attacks. Facebook then followed up its original statement by showing that it had removed the groups Carrillo and Justice were members of, promising that it would continue to review other Boogaloo groups while removing any content that glorifies what the two men did. But the director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism said simply banning a few Facebook groups likely won't have much of an effect. The Boogaloo movement, much like any other fringe political group, will simply continue to evolve and adapt to an ever-restrictive internet. These so-called Boogaloo boys show the potency of a well-timed message with the dry kindling that is the internet. Director Levin was quoted as saying, "You're going to see a lot of hornets making a lot of smaller nests." Is it just an unfortunate part of the age we live in that something like Facebook has been used to promote violence and extremism? Or is it simply a sad fact that people will always find a way to take innocuous things like social media and then use them to do each other harm? Perhaps we're too quick to label social media such as Facebook a problem, when it might simply be a mirror that reflects the darker aspects of our nature. Maybe Facebook isn't the problem at all. Maybe we are. On the morning of April 12, 2018, 27-year-old Renita Williams of Shreveport, Louisiana was at home minding her own business. She lived at home with her mother, Anita, and had just broken up with her long-term boyfriend, Jonathan Robinson. Like many relationships, the breakup had been a messy one, and a great deal of drama had unfolded on social media websites, mainly the most popular of them, Facebook. Apparently, Jonathan had moved on rather quickly from Renita and had recently started dating a woman from Houston, Texas named Sharika Taylor. And although it's not entirely clear what the ins and outs of the social media drama were, there had definitely been some exchange between the two women that had seriously enraged Jonathan Robinson. As foolish as it often is, men sometimes attempt to defend the honor of the women in their lives, but no one could have expected Jonathan to take such extreme measures in what amounted to little more than an exchange of harsh words. Because before Jonathan pulled up to Renita's place on the morning of April 12th, he had just driven by his aunt's house to retrieve something he'd previously hidden in the basement of her home, a high-caliber, semi-automatic rifle. He was so delirious with anger that he didn't even bother to turn off the engine of the vehicle he'd driven up in. He simply grabbed the rifle from the passenger seat, kicked in the dead-bolted front door to the house, and then started shooting. It seems those first few shots were merely to terrify those in the home, because no one was actually hurt during the first few minutes of the attack. Whilst her mother and younger brother escaped from the rear of the home, Jonathan quickly located a terrified Renita, who believed she was about to be immediately executed. But apparently her ex-boyfriend had other plans for her first. Keeping her at gunpoint, he told her to grab her cell phone and begin a Facebook Live broadcast. At first, Renita had no idea why she would need to do something like that, but all slowly became clear when Jonathan began to demand she apologize to Taylor, his new girlfriend. In a terrifying public display of humiliation, Jonathan could be seen pointing the barrel of his rifle at the mother of three's head while he made her apologize over and over again for the perceived offense. She was terrified, voice quivering as she complied. Meanwhile, Renita's mother was hiding in the backyard, having had the foresight to grab her cell phone before fleeing from the gunshots. With shaking hands, she hammered 911 onto her phone's touchscreen, then begged the dispatcher to send help in a hushed but terrified tone. Yet the police were far closer than she could have imagined, because Officer Brittany Mackey was actually within earshot of the gunfire. As soon as she heard the shots, she rolled up to St. Vincent Avenue at Natalie Street and got out of her vehicle with her pistol drawn. Jonathan Robinson looked up to see the cops arrive mere minutes after he'd burst into the home, and he was seething with rage. He immediately executed Renita as she kneeled on the floor below him, then walked out of the busted front door and began shooting at Officer Mackey. Using trees and parked vehicles as cover, Jonathan sent round after round of high-caliber rifle fire into the officer's patrol car, forcing her into cover. Mackey immediately got onto her radio and began calling in backup, with her colleagues actually hearing the sound of gunfire over the airwaves. She then got as low behind the back wheel of her patrol car as she possibly could, and prayed for swift reinforcements. Just 2 minutes later, that backup arrived in the form of Corporals Joshua Pettigrew and Greg Walker. They screeched up the street, coming to a stop just short of Officer Mackey's patrol car. The officers then jumped out of the vehicle, took cover behind the open doors, and sent a torrent of .45 caliber pistol bullets at Jonathan's firing position. The overwhelming firepower pushed him back into the house, and the two corporals lost track of their target. The next two cops on the scene were two special response team members, Corporals Landry Ducto and Michael Gerbine. The pair took off running for the other side of the street, but Jonathan opened fire once again, this time from a vantage point on the second floor of the house he was occupying. The air around them cracked and whizzed with .7.62 bullets, ricocheting off the concrete as they narrowly missed their targets, but luckily, neither officer was wounded. He's in a sniper position, another officer can be heard screaming on a police cruiser's dash cam. Get down. Robinson had the supreme advantage of a concealed elevated position coupled with high-caliber weaponry, and for almost an hour, he kept every officer pinned down and unable to approach his position. They were so heavily outgunned that the only two shots that managed to fire were to disable the car Robinson left running in the driveway when he barged into the Williams home. Plus, the police had no idea where he was even shooting from and couldn't risk civilian casualties by peppering the entire home with bullets. To the officers pinned down at the scene, waiting for a full special response team to arrive seemed like an eternity. Eventually, a full police SWAT team was pushing up towards the house, preparing to breach and clear the entire structure to locate and eliminate the active shooter. Yet just as the team was cleared to breach, Jonathan indicates to those on scene that he wished to surrender. They hesitated and fell right into his trap. He opened fire on them first and sent a bullet smashing through SRT operative Robert Entrikin's right wrist. "I've been hit," Entrikin cried over his radio. "Officer hit." Another torrent of bullets are exchanged for a few moments before a sudden lull in the volume of fire. Then, to the surprise of the attending officers, Jonathan appeared to walk out of the busted front door again. Only this time, he was unarmed, and he proceeded to lie down on the front lawn of the house in a show of surrender. The SR team rushed in, putting cuffs on the shooter before dragging him away. Renita's mother and brother are led away from the scene safely, but heartbreakingly, Renita had succumbed to her wounds before the EMTs could get to her. At his murder trial, Jonathan Robinson pled guilty to first-degree murder and admitted to investigators that he fired on police officers because he wanted to die. He narrowly escaped the death penalty by agreeing to a plea deal presented to him by prosecutors and was later sentenced to life in prison. 100 years ago, a person would have to drag another into a busy street to perform a public execution. But nowadays, all it takes is a few button clicks on a cell phone to have all your family and friends watching as you're executed in cold blood by some deranged killer. And such incidents can happen so fast that there's simply no way of preemptively or actively censoring them, no matter how hard Facebook might try. As long as there's a technology available that allows us to share all the intimate details of our lives, humanity seems to relish in sharing not just the good and positive, but also the darker, more terrifying things too. Stephen Nicholson's arrest as the main suspect in a violent, indecent assault and murder sparked off one of the UK's biggest evidence searches, which involved a trawl of thousands of hours of CCTV footage. He was the prime suspect in the murder of Lucy McHugh and actually rented a room in her parents' home at the time of her murder. At one point, it looked like the British police might actually have to let him go due to lack of evidence, but in the end, it was a Facebook password that proved to be his ultimate undoing. After he was arrested, the police had just 96 hours to charge him with the murder, or he would have to be released. And given that it would take 4 weeks to get a key piece of DNA evidence analyzed and sent back to them, the clock was ticking to find something concrete that they could use to charge him with murder. The police subjected Stephen to vigorous questioning and managed to get him to admit that Lucy had sent him a Facebook message on the night before she was killed. When pressed as to what that message said, he said she told him she was pregnant with his child. He intended this to be evidence that it couldn't possibly have been him that killed her, but when police asked him to hand over his Facebook password so that they could verify his claims, he refused to give it to them. This was his one big mistake. When asked why he refused to share the password with them, Stephen told officers that he was involved quite heavily with some narcotics dealers around his hometown, and that revealing his messages would compromise them, possibly even causing them to take reprisals against him. But this didn't wash with investigating officers, who became convinced that the information contained within the account could be used against him. It also presented them with a marvelous opportunity. There were 2 options available to them. One being to seek the compliance of US federal courts to get Facebook to hand over Stephen's passwords to them, but that would have taken way longer than just 96 hours. And by that time, Stephen would be freed. But the other was to make use of some terrorism legislation, what is known as Section 53 of the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, colloquially called RIPA among police officers. This means that anyone who seeks to withhold information, such as computer passwords, during a serious crime investigation can basically be charged with obstruction of justice. Right when it looked like Stephen was going to be bailed, he was rearrested, and after pleading guilty to withholding evidence at Southampton Crown Court, he was jailed for 14 months. With that, the police managed to buy themselves more time to find evidence of his involvement in Lucy McHugh's murder. However, while there was plenty of circumstantial evidence that Stephen had killed Lucy, there was nothing to physically link the spot where Lucy's body was found at Nicholson. Whatever weapon he used to kill her remained unaccounted for, and police officers were unable to find any of his DNA at the scene. Once again, investigators were forced to focus on Stephen's so-called online footprint, this time seeking help from an experienced cloud data analyst to try to link Stephen to the scene of the crime. A cloud data analyst's job is to study various pieces of digital information sent from Nicholson's phone to data servers, which are owned by companies such as Google and Facebook. While tracing the phone's route on the day of Lucy's murder, the analyst happened to notice a small blip in an area of Southampton that the police had not yet searched. It suggested that Nicholson had, for whatever reason, deviated from his most direct route home. The diversion took him to a place known as Tanner's Brook, a stream which meanders through Southampton, weaving its way through some pretty dense woodland in the western portion of the city. Detective Superintendent Paul Barton later said to journalists, "With the help of the analyst, what we discovered was a slight deviation on his telephone, which didn't match the story he'd given us. You could say it had jumped a mast, so to speak, and therefore put Stephen at the place where we discovered some bloody, discarded clothing. It was a great bit of work from the analyst who pointed it out." The subtle shift in the narrative given by the killer was enough for police to launch one of the largest ever fingertip searches, which involved almost 200 officers from 12 other police forces. By that point, it had been 4 weeks since Lucy's dead body was found, but on the first day of the search, police got the exact kind of breakthrough that they had been hoping for. They found a discarded plastic bag containing a blue bloodstained hoodie, along with a number of other items that were described in court as Nicholson's murder kit. The blue hoodie contained Nicholson's DNA, as well as Lucy's blood, with Stephen being thought to have dumped the clothing, some of which had been partially burnt, near the brook after getting changed on his return from the murder scene on July 25th. Prior to the discovery of the clothing, police had no other direct evidence of Nichols' involvement in her killing. They had tested fibers from every bloodstained jacket and Stephen's clothes, which suggested direct contact with the hoodie, but that simply wasn't enough to actually charge him with a crime. Homicide detectives had already established that hoodies of the same type were sold to 2 people in the Southampton area, and that one of them was given a present to a man who knew a friend of Stephen's. The DNA evidence was the final nail in the coffin for Nicholson, according to Detective Superintendent Barton. During the course of the investigation, police officers had studied 11,000 hours of CCTV footage, examined over 2,000 pieces of physical evidence, and taken more than 300 written reports. A Herculean amount of work had given them a strong circumstantial case, but in the end, genetic evidence was what the police really needed to prove that Stephen was Lucy's killer. But had Stephen not been jailed over refusing to hand over his Facebook password, the outcome could have been very, very different. The 14-month jail sentence not only bought the police a great deal of time, but it also potentially stopped Stephen from going back to Tanner's Brook to move the evidence he had dumped there. And it's frankly astounding that the killer of a child might well be walking the streets right now if it wasn't for something as simple as a Facebook password. Public prosecutors were eventually granted access to Stephen's Facebook account on the first day of his murder trial, but found that he had deleted most of his messages before he was arrested. As it turned out, it didn't matter in the least bit if Stephen gave them the password. He still wouldn't be able to be charged based on the absence of the messages. If he'd only gone and given police the password, he might still be free to walk the streets. One of the prosecutors, a Mr. Montague, criticized the protracted process, saying that for him, the personal side, the human side, is we have a 13-year-old child that has been murdered under ferocious circumstances. And for me, it's somewhat frustrating that Facebook seems so unwilling to help with our investigation by recovering deleted messages. Facebook said it had worked closely with the investigating officers, but that they agree that this legal process can be far too slow. We have actually lobbied for reforms to EU, US, and UK laws to allow us and others to directly and more quickly provide information to UK law enforcement authorities, a spokeswoman for the company said. But despite the slow process, police have been able to build a case against an extremely narcissistic, self-centered, violent predator who had torn apart a family kind enough to put a roof over his head when they could have easily turned him away. He preyed on their underage daughter, and when it looked like she might actually tell on him, he killed her. But at no point could he have expected that something as seemingly insignificant as his Facebook password would actually be the thing to put him behind bars. On the night of December 16, 2019, 49-year-old road sweeper Mark Branford proposed to his 32-year-old girlfriend, Kaylee Dunning. The couple had been through some extremely rough times together, with Kaylee being subjected to some horrendous abuse online that had left her dependent on antidepressants. In October of the previous year, Kaylee's phone had been stolen, a phone that had contained a number of intimate selfies of her, lewds and nudes that some might call them. On discovering them, the sick individual who stole her phone then sent these images to Kaylee's father, brother, and employer. The same person then set up a Facebook account using some of the illicit photos of Kaylee as display and cover photos. The whole ordeal was obviously extremely damaging to her mental health, and she increasingly sought comfort from Mark. As much as it was a horrible time for her, the trauma only strengthened their relationship, with Mark being able to prove that he could make her feel better after being subjected to such a dreadful abuse. They both tried to push back against those that were doing it, with Kaylee going to the police numerous times, while Mark also claimed to be receiving multiple abusive messages. He even claimed to have at one point called the phone number that was connected to the Facebook account and said he had heard scarily familiar voices on the other end. But despite their best efforts, the police simply couldn't do anything about it, and the couple were forced to basically endure the abuse together. This all led to the night he proposed to her, or at least this is what we're led to believe, because a night that began with him asking for her hand in marriage ended with Kaylee being beaten to death with a crowbar. What we know for certain is that Mark Branford, the very same man with whom Kaylee sought refuge from the anonymous online abuse, was actually the very same man who was sending her the abusive messages in the first place. He was the one who had stolen Kaylee's phone, using it to set the fake Facebook account while sending her nudes to her friends, family, and colleagues. But what's not clear is what led up to the killing, and that there are only two main theories that we can fall back on to explain the sequence of events. The first theory is that the murder wasn't planned, that somehow in the course of proposing marriage, Mark had felt so guilty that he admitted to being the one behind the abuse. Maybe he'd only done it to drive Kaylee away from her family and friends, to ensure he was the only one she could trust or the only one she loved. And in the end, he simply couldn't bear to keep the secrets going. She might have freaked out, threatened to tell everyone, threatened to have her family teach him a rather violent lesson. That might well have been the reason why Mark had made the spur-of-the-moment decision to take her life. But there is a considerably more disturbing theory, one that says Mark had been planning to kill Kaylee for a long, long time, and has used the whole Facebook abuse thing to get the idea out there that Kaylee had stalkers, or at least people so fixated on her that her death could be blamed on them. We know from his own admissions in court that Mark was an extremely jealous man who sought to use the fake Facebook accounts and the anonymous abuse to control Kaylee. He denies murdering her, but the more information and evidence that comes out regarding the killing, the more it's becoming clear that no one else could have possibly killed her. She was found dead in his home at Kingston Crescent, and there were no signs of any break-in to support the idea that she was killed by anyone else other than Mark. This is just another bizarre and terrifying example of how people have managed to use something like Facebook, a thing which was designed to bring human beings together and strengthen social bonds, for something unspeakably divisive and evil. Mark used Facebook to break his girlfriend down, to the point that she needed medication to continue her daily existence. And when she was at her lowest point, he brutally murdered her with a crowbar. It's frankly horrifying how people see the potential for death and destruction in even the most benign places. That people can be so creatively evil that they see the potential for ruination in something as seemingly normal as a social media app. I'm kind of weird about social media these days. I used to be really into Facebook when I first moved to college. It kept me in touch with family and friends back home, and it was a nice feeling like I wasn't so far away from them. Building up a collection of photos, checking into places, sharing every little detail of my life so that everyone could see how great I was doing. My entire world was online for all to see. And because I'm dumb, I was pretty liberal about my privacy setting too. So one day I get this message request from someone that I've never heard of before. It just said, "Hey." I checked their profile to see if they were in the same class as me or something, but it turned out we had no mutuals, and they lived on the other side of the country. So as you can imagine, I'm pretty confused as to why they're messaging me, but I'm also curious. So I just reply, "Hey man, do we know each other?" I don't know what I was expecting him to say when I saw that he was typing a reply. And I remember thinking that maybe he was looking for someone with the same name as me or something. But then his response pops up and all it said was, "I'm going to kill you," with a cowboy emoji on the end. I stare at the message for a few seconds, not scared at all, just like, what? I mean, the cowboy emoji was what made me take another look at this dude's profile, seeing a bunch more pictures of him shooting guns and wielding knives in the woods somewhere. I mean, that was at least a little intimidating, but what got me were all these rants that he'd posted about how much life sucked, how unfair things were, and how he'd love to take it out on someone who deserved it. And then the videos that were unplayable because they'd been removed by Facebook admins, but still had captions like, "That chainsaw goes through his neck like butter," and a crying laughing face emoji. That's when I started to worry. It didn't seem like this guy was just having fun, playing a prank on a stranger by trying to scare them. He seemed legit crazy and seriously angry. That nutcase could have been studying every one of my statuses, picture posts and check-ins for weeks before he decided to message me. He could have screenshotted all of my stuff too, so it didn't matter if I blocked him or not. He had my name, my school, where I hung out, the names of my family and friends, everything. I thought maybe I was just making a big deal out of nothing at the time, but later on I could barely sleep thinking about it. How horrifying a thought it was that he could have been driving across the country as I lay there in bed, having just picked a person at random to kill and being crazy or angry enough to actually do it. You can call me paranoid all you like, but I just couldn't get this guy out of my head. Like the idea of him hunting me down or whatever was unnerving enough. I mean, he had enough info on me to be able to ambush me at a dozen different places that I just couldn't avoid because they were school or grocery shopping or just my dorm. But what had me freaked out is that creep might have been able to learn so much about me, and I was dumb or vain enough to let it happen in the first place. I knew the internet was full of crazies. I just didn't expect it to reach and touch me in the way that it did. If I didn't make it clear already, I did actually block the guy, but some weird grim curiosity had me unblocking his account one day so I could sort of check up on him and make sure he wasn't about to do something too nuts. There were no rants, no threatening statuses, just a long series of photo posts that made me think that he'd taken up photography or something. I'm scrolling through them when I start to get this familiar feeling from looking at the scenery. I couldn't be 100% sure, but I'd swear a lot of the pictures he'd taken were of things that were around the town I was living in. There were no street signs or anything, nothing that actually confirmed he'd actually driven across the country, but if he wasn't taking pictures in a town that looked remarkably similar to mine, then I could have been in a whole lot of trouble. I expected that guy to jump me for weeks after, like I was a complete nervous wreck. It messed with my sleep, I lost a bunch of weight, being in an almost constant state of anxiety for the better part of a month. He didn't find me. Nothing happened as a result, thank God. But just knowing he could pretty much come and get me anytime he liked got to me in ways I never even imagined it ever could. We put ourselves on Front Street in a big way with social media, and it could literally be anyone out there just lurking on our profiles. So like I said, now I'm kind of weird and cautious about social media. I don't put too much out there, and I don't use any real name. I run the strictest privacy settings possible, and I really recommend you do too. I live here in a place called Mountain City down here in Tennessee. So this is going back about 10 years after I graduated high school when this really messed up story started going around about one of the other kids that I graduated with. It starts in the worst possible way too, because first I heard of it was a buddy of mine texting me saying, "Did you hear about Billy Payne?" I text back saying no, and he then calls me all serious sounding to say that Billy and his baby mom got shot just a few days before. Like someone rolled up to their house, bust open the door and just shot them both right there in front of the television. They were legit executed. Some of the papers said it was a single shot to the head that killed both victims and how Billy's throat had been slashed. We got to wondering why someone might do something like that. If it was a random psycho killer or if he was moving weight and managed to step on someone's toes. I did remember hearing about Billy messing around with drugs a few times, so it wasn't totally out of the question, but he must have done something serious to have whoever it was shoot his baby mama right there too. Like that's real cold-blooded, you know? But even saying that, he just didn't seem like the kind of guy to get involved with serious gangbangers. Anyway, the cops catch the two guys who committed the murder. One of them is this Vietnam vet who said in court that he was ex-CIA too. Anyway, they get charged, go up in front of a judge, and you know why they said they did it? Because the CIA had told them that the two murder victims were part of some evil group that was planning on killing their daughter. But in reality, Billy Payne and his baby mom were shot dead because they unfriended one of the killer's daughters on Facebook. Can you actually believe that? That someone would take social media that seriously and actually kill somebody because of a friend request? I mean, I didn't. I was convinced that there was more to it than that, and as much as it made me feel like a gorehound, I stayed interested in the trial to find out why they'd done something so horrendous. Like the cops found Billy's baby alive in his mom's arms. Poor kid is going to grow up without a mother and a father. But then yeah, that's the only reason or motive established, and the prosecutor brings up Facebook messages detailing intense arguments between Billy, his girlfriend, and the girl who got unfriended. They'd argue about it back and forth for hours with some pretty harsh language exchanged too, and then the girl says that she's going to tell her dad. I don't know if the girl just didn't expect her dad to actually go kill them or that she knew he'd overreact. But if it's the latter, then she has blood on her hands too, as far as I'm concerned. Like it's the way she told her dad too. She just didn't tell him direct. She invented some fake CIA agent that got in touch with her dad over Facebook to tell them all this messed up stuff about how their daughter was in grave danger. I suppose it just scares me that people could take something like Facebook that seriously, but it's obvious that some people out there put so much belief in social media that they're willing to kill over perceived insults or whatever. And that's why I keep my social media presence pretty small these days. Aside from all the ratchety drama that goes on in our timelines every so often, it's just not a healthy place for some people. And it kind of blows my mind that Facebook could be the reason that anyone got shot. So first of all, I have to apologize for my English because it's not my first language, but this is definitely one of the scariest and most horrible things I've ever heard. A few years ago, we had this big incident here in the Philippines involving Facebook. This guy's wife was over in Canada for her job, and she got into an argument with the husband via Facebook. I think he wanted her to come home to Quezon early because he missed her or something, and she refuses because her contract isn't finished yet. I'm guessing the husband was being really nasty and unreasonable because for some reason the wife stops replying to his messages altogether. Now this couple had a 7-year-old daughter together, one whose picture the media showed a lot in the days after the incident. She was so cute, and it breaks my heart that anything happened to her. But it also makes my blood go cold that anyone could lay a finger on her, especially the girl's own father. Because in response to his wife ignoring him on Facebook, maybe even threatening to leave him, I don't know, he actually kills their daughter. He stabbed her in the neck and chest, then took pictures of the body and uploaded them to Facebook while tagging his wife in the pictures. Can you imagine how horrific that must have been? To get a notification on your phone or laptop or whatever device, seeing you'd been tagged in a picture, only to then see it was your own dead child. Not only that, but your husband, the kid's dad, the one other person in the world whose one job above all else is to protect them, is the one that actually murdered them. That's true horror to me. Like I can't even wrap my head around it. There was video released of him in custody, I think his name was Mark, and the police were showing him pictures of what he'd done to his daughter. And this guy is just screaming and screaming, not being able to believe he'd killed his own child. I think he'd just gone temporarily insane, or however you say it, but the idea that human beings are capable of such horrific things, like when they see red and just black out, and then are able to kill someone so precious to them, that's about the worst thing I can possibly think of. And it just makes it even more sick that something as supposedly harmless as Facebook was involved, that social media can enable us to make horrific things even worse. I always think about this case whenever I hear about Facebook, and I know the majority of the site is just Candy Crush invites and baby photos, but it's tainted my opinion of the site forever. I know Facebook has people that remove all the bad content, but they can't be everywhere all the time. And I wonder how many people saw the pictures of that dead girl before they actually got taken down. Even one is too many, if you ask me. Sometimes Facebook just seems like a powder keg of trouble. They had this weird ability to help exacerbate drama to the point where someone gets hurt. A really good example of this is what happened back in 2012 in the town I live in here in Holland. So there were these two friends of about 15 or 16 years old who went to a New Year's Eve house party together. They ended up getting pretty drunk and having an argument because one of the girls was making out with guys and her friend didn't like it. So the next day, one friend basically calls the other a sleaze on Facebook. So the friend who got called sleazy complained to one of the guys she'd been making out with at the party, who said that if she wanted to, he could teach the judgmental friend a lesson. I think it says a lot about how petty and spiteful teenage girls can be to each other, but the girl who got accused of being sleazy says yes to this, that she wanted her friend to regret saying mean things to her. So instead of just sending over some rude messages or whatever, this guy gets in touch with another friend of his, who agrees to actually go over to this girl's house to beat her up or something. Yeah, actual violence because of a few comments on freaking Facebook. Only he doesn't just slap her around or whatever. He takes a knife over to the girl's house, rings on her door, and then stabs her repeatedly with it. That's when this girl's dad appears to try and defend her. The kid then stabs him too. The girl ended up dying a week or so later in the hospital, and it was a huge news story here in Holland. But I think the really horrible thing is that the kid who did the actual stabbing only spent a year in juvenile detention with a few years of probation afterward. The two kids who organized the killing ended up getting more time in prison than the actual murderer, but even then it was only 2 years. I know the prosecutor tried to get them more time in jail, but that didn't work in the end, and these kids basically got off super lightly for legit murdering someone, and all because of an argument that unfolded over Facebook. That was the hardest part to swallow. The Dutch media even christened the whole thing Facebook moord, as like a nickname which basically just meant the Facebook murder in Dutch. I'm not saying the whole murder wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for Facebook, but honestly, there's no doubt that it made it easier to organize. Like I know for a fact that the older guy managed to get in touch with the guy who actually carried out the attack via Facebook, and maybe he wouldn't have been able to organize that without it. Stuff like Facebook is supposedly there to bring us together, right? So it's just a terrible thought that people can then use it to rip each other's families apart. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Dr. Pepper during a live stream is highly inconvenient.